It will be.
Yep.
The other option is that we completely change the motion next, meeting and say, address it to whoever the next government is. So there will be one member.
Should do both.
Maybe, yeah. In any case, I would like to pass it tonight so we can.
All right, good evening, everyone. As we begin, please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices, and I'll remind council that our procedure bylaw prescribes the use of technology during council meetings. It is 6:31 p.m. I'll call this council meeting to order. And in doing so, I will formally recognize the traditional keepers of this land and specifically our neighbors of the Alderville First Nation with a formal territorial acknowledgement. We are meeting on the Gunshot Treaty lands of 1788. It is on these lands and on the shores of the Big Lake that we now know as Lake Ontario that the Mississauga and Anishinaabe met with the Crown to facilitate the opening of these lands for settlement. Let us be reminded of the responsibility we all have in making sure that we respect these lands and waters that give us life and sustain our livelihoods. And the first motion is moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that Council amend the February 18th, 2025 Council agenda to add Correspondence Section 16.1, a letter from Northumberland County regarding designating a female council member to participate in International Women's Day professional development event. That letter is on your tables. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. And a second motion by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Butwell, that Council suspend the rules of the procedural bylaw to hear the notice of motion from Councillor Wheeldon as a motion. So we'll be suspending the rules when we get to that section if this is passed by a 2/3 majority vote. Is there any discussion? Councillor Wheeldon.
I just want to give some context to that. The motion, as I wrote it, was aimed at all parties during an election. And I realized after I submitted it that by the time we get to our next meeting, the election will be over. So it would make it largely moot if we were to pass it at the next meeting as it is currently written. So either we look at it tonight or I rewrite it before the next meeting.
Either way, there will be an amendment of some sort, so it's up to council how they want to go. Is there any further discussion on the motion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is also carried. So we will consider the notice of motion as a motion when we get there. And a motion moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council approve the February 18th, 2025 council agenda as amended. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Members of council, have you any declarations of pecuniary interest? And if so, please state the general nature thereof. There are none noted. Actually, I will declare, because we are talking about the budget, that if any discussion comes up with regard to the Hilton Cemetery, I am a member of the Board of Directors of Trinity St. Andrews United Church, which is the owner and operator of Hilton Cemetery. Are there any announcements this evening? Councillor Wheeldon.
I just wanted to give a quick update about the FCM Sustainable Communities Conference. And I want to thank council once again for passing the motion that allowed me to go to an out-of-province conference. It was an incredibly enriching time. I connected really well with the county sustainability officer, Corey McKay, and we talked about ways we can collaborate between upper and lower tier for sustainability in Northumberland. I also managed to have lunch with the chair of CMHC. And I got the personal cell phone number of the federal minister for housing. So all of these programs from the Green Municipal Fund are available to us, whether or not we go to conference, but sometimes it's good to be there.
Good work. Thank you for that. Councillor Rowley.
I just want to, I think on behalf probably of council, that we publicly thank our public works staff over this last week. I'm sure it has been very long days for our staff, and I just want to compliment them on a job well done. I was able to get out when I needed to.
Here, well done. Any other announcements this evening? Brings us to the adoption of the minutes. I have a motion moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson. The council adopt the February 3rd, 2025 council meeting minutes as presented. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wright. The council adopt the February 10th council planning meeting minutes as presented. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Are there any opposed? That motion is carried. And a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council adopt the Committee of the Whole budget meeting minutes for January 15th, 29th, and February 7th, 2025 as presented. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. That brings us to delegations and presentations. Council will hear two presentations this evening, both from the same person. The presenter has 15 minutes per presentation to provide council with their information. It is noted that language, content, and conduct must always remain respectful. Council will be provided with an opportunity to ask questions of clarification from the presentation representative based on the information that they have presented. Council is reminded that this is not an opportunity to engage in debate with the presenter, nor advance a public policy position. Presenters are reminded that council does not make decisions during the presentation portion of this evening's meeting. So the presenter for both presentations is Peter Simcisco of Watson and Associates, and the first presentation will be with regard to a DC addendum. Welcome back, Mr. Simcisco.
Good evening, everyone, and oops. So as council may recall, our firm, Watson and Associates Economists, has been in the process of developing a development charges background study for the municipality for some time. And the purpose of today's meeting is just to provide council with an update on some changes that have been made to the original background study that we presented back in June of last year, and to the resulting bylaw that's in front of council for consideration later today. So if we could go right to the next slide after this, please. So just as a quick recap of the process that has been undertaken to date, we published the original development charges background study back in June of last year. Following the release of that background study, we undertook a consultation with the development industry in early July. Following that consultation, there was a formal statutory public meeting as required under the Development Charges Act that was held. Following that public meeting, it was deemed prudent to extend the timeline or the expiry of the existing development charges bylaw to provide some additional time for refinements to be made to the calculations in the development charges study itself, as well as some additional consultation around that process. And so in August, council approved an amending bylaw that extended the expiry date of the existing development charges bylaw to December 2nd. And then later in November, council approved another amending bylaw that further extended the expiry of the existing development charge bylaw to March 3rd. Around that time, we also responded to a number of pieces of correspondence that were submitted to the municipality from various members of the development community. Following that, we made some revisions to and updates to the calculations as well. Then we undertook a second consultation session just earlier in February of this year to present the changes that were made to the calculations and the resulting impact on the proposed development charge rates. And then that brings us to just last week when we released a formal addendum to the development charges background study that formally addresses all of the changes that have been made. And as I said earlier, I'll be walking you through those changes in the presentation today. So there were changes made within 4 areas as they pertain to the calculation of the development charge. Firstly, within the area of roads and related services or services related to a highway, there were some updates to various cost estimates for projects that are included in a development charge calculation that were undertaken. Also, in response to some of the feedback received from the development community, there were some adjustments made to the benefit to existing calculations for some projects, particularly the Presqu'île Parkway paved shoulder project, where we recognized the 10% benefit to deduction. There was the removal of the mechanical sweeper from the capital needs listing, but also an addition of a new pickup truck based on the municipality's 2025 capital budget. And so the net impact of those changes is an additional approximately $600,000 that has been included in the calculation of the charge. On the next slide, we have a summary of the changes for within the fire protection services area. Again, there was a addition of a new truck to the capital needs listing based on the municipality's 2025 capital budget. Based on some feedback again from the development community, we reviewed the capital cost estimate for the fire station expansion project. There were some land acquisition costs that were previously included in that cost estimate, but based on further discussions with the municipality, it was determined that no additional land is required for that expansion at this point. So those land acquisition costs have been removed from the calculation. We also had to make more of a technical change, had to make some changes to the post-period benefit deduction for that expansion of the station as well. And so the net impact on the capital costs that are actually included in the calculation of the charge are zero. So the calculated rates for fire protection services are as they were when we last met. On the next slide, we have a summary of the changes within the wastewater services area. The one change here has been a change of the scope of the wastewater treatment system upgrades, which now includes the expansionary component as well. The cost estimate for that project has been updated based on the latest cost estimates that are available, about $47.3 million. But we also recognize that there is the grant funding that has been secured by the municipality to go towards that project as well in the amount of about $35 million. And so that has been appropriately reflected in the calculations as well. And so based on those revisions, we're including about $2.03 million of that cost of the treatment system upgrades and expansion in the calculation of the development charge. I would note, and you see this in the bottom right of the slide, there's an additional $4.1 million that can potentially be recovered through development charges, but that would be from growth beyond the 10-year forecast period, which is what we refer to as a post-period benefit in this case. And so the net impact on the capital costs that are included in the calculation of the charge is a decrease of about $2.5 million relative to the original background study. The final area with some changes are water services, where there have been, again, some changes to the capital projects included in the calculation of the charge, the removal of a water main, which is deemed to no longer be required, some adjustments to the benefit to existing calculation for the water main twinning project, and then updates to cost estimates for the Harbor Street water main upsizing, as well as the new booster station, and then a very minor revision to the outstanding debt calculation on the water plant. And so the net impact of those changes is a reduction of about $1.5 million to the net capital costs that are included in the calculation of the charge. So on the next slide, then, we provide a comparison of the development charge rates. In this table, we're presenting the rates that apply to a single detached dwelling. In the second column of the table, you will see the development charge rates that are currently in effect, broken down by service area, as well as the grand totals for the rural area, as well as the urban serviced area at the very bottom of the table. What we are then showing in the third column of the table are the development charge rates that were shown in the original background study and that were presented at the public meeting last year. And then in the second last column of the table, you will see the updated development charge rates that are within the proposed development charge bylaw as they sit today. And then the final column shows the difference of how different the calculated rates are as per the addendum report relative to the charges or rates that were presented during the public meeting. So in terms of the roads and related component of the charge, there has been about a 14% increase to the calculated charge. Within the wastewater services area, there has been a decrease of about 57% relative to the charges that were presented last year at the public meeting. That's largely a result of the grant funding that has been secured for that expansion project. And then within the water services area, the charges decreased by about 25% relative to the rates that were presented mid last year. So that does still represent a significant increase relative to the charges that are currently in effect. In terms of the total charges applicable to a single detached dwelling within the rural areas, we're looking at about a 53% increase. So from $11,600 per unit to about $17,800 per unit. And then within the urban serviced areas, which include the water, wastewater components of the charge, the rate is going from $14,300 per unit to about $29,500 per unit based on the updated calculations. On the next slide, we provide a comparison of both the current development charge rates, again applicable in this case to a single detached dwelling within the municipality, and comparing those to the rates that are in effect in other area municipalities. The comparison does include upper tier development charges where applicable to provide a more holistic sense of what the total development charges payable are on a new single detached home in these different jurisdictions. And so the gray arrow that's on the right-hand side of the illustration shows you where those rates are today for, again, a single detached home. And with the teal arrow, that's the left of the two arrows, points to where those rates would be based on the rates in the proposed bylaw. So certainly, again, a notable increase from the development charge rates that are currently in effect. But we can also see that with the proposed rates, that would keep the municipality well within the range of development charges we see in other jurisdictions. Very similar comparison on the next slide here. In this case, we are showing the development charges payable per square foot of non-residential gross floor area. Very similar in terms of the order of magnitude in the changes. So we're seeing about a 13% increase to the calculated rate within the services related to a highway section, or about 46 cents per square foot relative to the rates that were presented in the June background study. We are seeing a decrease within the wastewater services area of about $2.55 per square foot. That represents about a 57% decrease from the rates previously presented. And then within the water services area, we were looking at about a $1.53 decrease per square foot relative to the rates that were presented in the June report. So in total, relative to the rates that are currently in effect within the rural areas, we're looking at about a 81 cent per square foot increase, which represents a 12% increase relative to the rates that are currently in effect. And then within the urban serviced areas, we're looking at an increase from $8.62 per square foot to about $14.33 per square foot. So that represents about a 66% increase relative to the rates that are currently in effect. The next slide provides a similar comparison, again, this time for the development charges payable per square foot of commercial gross floor area, comparing those rates to other area municipalities and showing that with the increase that's being proposed, that would again keep the municipality still well within the range of development charges that we see in other area municipalities. So that summarizes the changes that have occurred since June. Again, we've seen overall a reduction to the calculated development charge rates that were previously presented. In terms of next steps, on the next slide, in order for Council to enact the new development charges bylaw, Council will need to approve the development charges background study as presented in June and as amended through the addendum report that's within your agenda today. Council will also need to determine that no further public meetings are required on the matter. As mentioned earlier, we already held a public meeting last year. And then finally, to approve the new development charges bylaw.
Thank you, Mr. Simcisco. I'll ask members of council if they have any questions of clarification for you. Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you, Mayor. I have two questions. Was the multi-use recreational building that we have tentatively engaged towards included in this?
So I would have to look at the specific capital needs list is within the background study itself. We could take a look at what's included within the recreation area. If you just bear with me for a moment here.
Yeah, my apologies. I did get this question from the public, so I want to follow up.
So we do have, and this is on page 5-7 of the original background study, there is a new recreation facility that's been included, not the full extent of those costs, but we had about a $22 million cost estimate for that new facility. Of that, about $2.7 million is included in the calculation of the development charge.
Okay, so it's only partially included then.
That's correct. And that's
Okay.
because there was deemed to be some benefit to the existing population or community that that project would produce as well.
For sure, yeah. We've just struck the committee on determining whether and how to go about that. And so some had deemed it was maybe premature to include it. Can I ask my second question? The housing forecast that's included in the addendum here. It's listing 72 units per year, 70 units per year. I know this past year was 114 units and the previous year was 66, so 72 seems kind of in the middle. I'm wondering, is this housing forecast based on the provincial growth forecast, or is this based on our planning pipeline? Because I know that there was a significant difference between what the province suggested for growth in our in the county OP amendments and what we have in our planning pipeline and what we use to apply for provincial funding recently. So it seems like we're expecting more growth than the province thinks we're going to get.
To answer your question, the growth forecast underpinning the development charges study is based on the Northumberland County Municipal Comprehensive Review.
Which has always been lower than the actuals since my time around here anyway.
Yeah, I only ask because it's my understanding that if we get more houses, if we calculate based on less houses than we're actually building, then the DCs are going to be higher per house, and that's not going to be adjusted downwards as we produce more houses. Is that correct?
So the needs that, or the capital costs that are included in the calculation of the charge have been assessed relative to that growth increment that we've identified for 10 years. So presumably, if we were planning for a bigger growth increment, there would be more additional capital needs that may be required as well. I'll use the example of the wastewater treatment capacity expansion. So in that calculation, we do recognize that the capacity that will be created through that expansion will be enough to service growth beyond our 10-year growth increment that's in the background study. So that's where that post-period benefit component comes in that I was referring to earlier. So we do try to ensure that on a per capita basis, the calculation is appropriate. So in other words, if there was more growth, again, there would be more or additional capital needs that would be rolled into the calculation of the charge as well.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Any other questions? Councillor Rowley.
I'll just start with one. So first question being, if we were undecided, can this bylaw be extended again? Or are we at our limit with that? I don't know. This is our second extension, I believe. Are we allowed to extend it longer if we wanted some more answers?
Can you answer that, Mr. Simsisco? Would you prefer the CAO answer it?
I can, up to you.
You've got the microphone.
So technically speaking, yes, the current bylaw could be extended. That would need to be done by way of an amending development charge bylaw that would need to be approved by council. I would note that the current bylaw expires on March 3rd. So that amending bylaw would need to be passed before that point in time.
To be tonight?
Tonight is our last regular council meeting before March 3rd. So either we do it tonight or we have, if we were to decide not to go forward tonight, we would have to hold a special council meeting because staff would need time to draft the bylaw.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to go back to the wastewater services. Yes, we did receive a significant grant for wastewater. There's also been a little bit of talk of maybe applying for other grants. If we were to get more money, would that bring that number down again a little bit more? Or once we do this, we can't go back and say, oh, well, we got another 10 million. I'm just using that. We can't take that off the development charges then, once we pass a bylaw.
Mr. Simsisco.
The development charge study and the rates can be amended at any time. There is a required public process that we need to go through, but council always has the ability to update the study or the bylaw itself.
May I ask another question?
You may.
Thank you. There are a couple of items in here that are included in this. I want to ask about the Presqu'île Parkway and also about North Street. When I try to get my head around this, I think of expansion when we're adding DC. I don't see how we're doing any kind of significant expansion around the Presqu'île Parkway nor North Street. There's really no room to put more houses in there. So how's that justified in this?
Mr. Simsisco.
Thank you. So the Parkway in particular, in discussions with the municipality staff, the understanding is that the paved shoulder is being put in place in response to increased traffic volumes that are driven by new development, both that has occurred in the past and that's yet to occur. And so that provides for better active transportation, for example, uses along that route in light of the increased traffic volume. So that was the reasoning for including that in the calculation of the charge. With respect to North Street, again, there are areas where there are improvements needed, for example, to stormwater infrastructure that are through these urbanization projects that are included in the calculation of the charge. Some of them may be driven by development that has already occurred. Some of these projects are carryovers from prior development charge studies and have been identified in the municipality's development charges study for a while, just haven't been completed yet.
Any other questions from members of council? Go ahead.
Thank you. So just based on your reasoning, I'm going to say regarding North Street and improving stormwater, we could say that then for every street in Brighton. So how high, when do we then stop? Every time we have a new development, every time we have to add new stormwater pipes or whatever it is we do, how do we justify just picking one spot and not another spot?
Mr. Simsisco.
So in an ideal world, those needs are identified in a master plan. So either stormwater master plan, water wastewater master plan for water wastewater services. Those master plans typically look at both the existing demands as well as future growth and identify bottlenecks or areas that may require upsizing or some kind of improvement to handle additional flows from development, for example. There are a number of those types of studies that are included, in fact, in the calculation of the charge for the future. In the absence of those studies at this point in time, we are relying on the expertise of staff and identifying those projects that are brought to our attention, as these are some areas that do require upgrades that we feel are fully or partially related to new development that, again, has or is about to occur.
Councilor Wright.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure if it's you or if it's going to be Mr. Walsh to answer this question. You've mentioned Presqu'île Parkway and widening and putting a paved shoulder. I know Presqu'île Parkway to be a very environmentally sensitive spot, and in putting a paved shoulder there is going to kind of automatically cause cars to go faster. Just wondering if there's been any thought with that plan to install some sort of speed bump to slow traffic down. It can be a pretty scary spot already, even with the narrow roadway that it is.
Probably a question for our transportation master planning consulting engineer, but they're not here. Director Walsh, do you want to, I think you're pointing at me because I have the right answer.
To the mayor and the council, that was my answer.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was John Gooding's answer too,
Oh,
manager of
Wow.
infrastructure.
there's three of us.
Yeah.
When are we expecting to see that consultation come forward, CAO?
through you, Mr. Mayor, just in conversation today, we were aiming for April, but April, our month is early and short. Our last meeting's on the 15th, so it will be May the 6th that they're here.
So that's coming up soon, and I would anticipate we'd see some sort of traffic calming throughout the municipality, but there are specific places like that I know you identified it as places that we need some very specific traffic calming. So if it's not included in that master plan, I'm looking at you and I to make sure that we push back a little bit with the master planning consultant to make sure that happens. There and in a lot of other places in our community at the end of the day. Any other questions on the addendum? The presentation, that is. Councillor Rowley,
May I make a comment instead of ask a question?
if the comment is with regard to the presentation and not with regard to the overall addendum, otherwise I get you to hold off on their comment until I read the motion.
All right, I'll just wait until you read the
Very
motion.
well. Any final comments, Mr. Simcisco, before we read our motion here?
No, I think that's it on my end. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion is moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Rowley. Excuse me. Whereas Council received the DC background study on June 13th, 2024 and held a public meeting on July 15th, 2024. And whereas additional consultation was afforded to and comments were provided by the development community. Now therefore be it resolved that Council receive and approve without any further public meetings the Brighton 2024, is that correct? Yeah. 2024 DC background study and the DC addendum as presented this evening by Peter Simcisco, Watson and Associates. Councillor Rowley?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm still struggling with a couple of these things. Certainly with the new rec center, which although we would all love to see that happen tomorrow. I don't see that happening for a long time. With the way things are going here economically, not just in Brighton, in the county, in the province, in the country, I think kind of doubling the DC charges per unit seems like quite a bit of money and maybe a little stress on our developers. I would like, if council would support me, I would like to maybe extend it for one more time, just to have a little bit more conversation, regardless of whether it's with the public or just with the developers. And I think it's been great that the development community has been certainly engaged in this, but I'm still tossing this rec center thing around. It's a significant amount of money. As Councillor Wheeldon pointed out, we haven't even had a meeting yet to see whether a rec center is even feasible for Brighton. So I would like to hold off on that. And if that would mean giving another extension, whether it be 90 days or 60 days, I would be in support of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I would point out that a rec center, we don't know what size that would be or what would be contained in that. We've just got that process started, or not even started really. We've just struck the task force. But at some point we're going to need to replace that arena. That's just a reality. That's not a new building we're looking at. It's costing us significant amounts of money just to keep it running the way it is. A newer building would be significantly more efficient. And Mr. Simcisco pointed out that about 10% of an assumed value from about 6 years ago, I think, was encapsulated into this original study. So even if we are a few years out, the reality is a new building is going to be more than $22 million, and that's a sad reality. I think we're light on that, and that's to the benefit of the development community and in the charges that are being asked for at this stage. I'd also point out that it wasn't just a casual discussion that the development community were having. They brought in their own economist, and I thank our economists for sitting down and having that dialogue, making sure that we were being fair and reasonable at the end of the day. And I think that's what we're doing. I'm not a fan of DCs. I don't think it's a good or fair way to raise money for infrastructure, but it's the only way we have. And unless and until the province is willing to afford a different system of revenue for smaller municipalities like ours, it's the only tool in our kit at the moment. I suspect it'll be tinkered with a little more in the coming months and years, and we'll see where it ends up. But I, at this stage, would not be in favor of punting this down the road any further. Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you, Mayor, and I appreciate your comments there regarding the recreational building. That answers my questions about that and my concerns. I just want to comment on the broader context of this. The whole question of DCs and how necessary are they, how much are they adding to the cost of housing is a really big discussion right now, and I've been diving into that a little bit over the last few weeks, and found that much of the discussion about DCs as driving the cost of housing don't seem to apply in Brighton. In Toronto, DCs account for 36% of the cost of a house. And a house there, of course, is about 1.5 million plus. Here, it's more like 5%. So significant difference. What we are asking for in relation to the grand scheme of things is quite small. And as we've discussed, is very carefully oriented towards the things that are needed to support the development that is happening. I keep hearing in the news about how Waterloo is doing it wrong or Ottawa is doing it wrong. They're using DCs to pay for this, that, or the other thing that maybe they shouldn't have. And that does not seem to be the case here at all. At the end of the day, where we're hearing most of this stuff is from a few particular political parties, and some of which are campaigning really hard against DCs right now, even though it is the system that they themselves control. So I saw a chart that said that eliminating DCs is the most popular way of bringing housing costs down among PC supporters. And PC supporters make up 44% of the public right now in Ontario. So big majority territory if things carry on as they are. So the idea that DCs are being sort of demonized in the broader political discussion doesn't change the fact that this is what we need to support the growth of our community, and that until there is a better system, the people who are in charge of the DC system ultimately are the ones responsible for the situation that we're in. So we work with the system we've got until they change it, but I don't think we need to feel bad about passing this bylaw.
Councillor Boutwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Significant increase, especially on urban homes. Where I find this concerning is when we start talking about what are our most affordable options for people. $30,000 on a $400,000 home is significant and could be that make or break point to being able to afford it to a first-time home buyer, an individual on a single income. You add $30,000 onto an $800,000 townhouse. Well, that's more easily absorbed and passed on to the buyer, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the buyer that pays this. If we consider how expensive housing has become, unfortunately, we have spoken around this ring before about really pursuing options that keep housing affordable for our local buying population. We've talked about helping to guide the type of development that we want to make sure that there are more affordable options. And so adding this type of I get what you're saying. What I understand, it's true. There are very few mechanisms in place, or there are no mechanisms in place, but specific to the recreational center, this is something that's still just pie in the sky for us. And I would assert that until we know what we're building, we can't put a price on it. So I'd more than be in favor of punting this down the pipe, specifically with this issue on the recreation center.
Thank you, Councillor Wright.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm assuming, looking at the line of Parks and Recreation Services, the calculated is pretty easy. So the $5,247 that's listed there, how much of that would be attributed to the future Parks and Rec building that we're looking at, potentially looking at?
Mr. Simcisco.
If you give me a couple of minutes, I can
You
get
have
back
as
to you.
many
Yeah.
minutes as you need to look that one up. Councillor Wheeldon, while that's being investigated.
Thank you. I wonder if it's possible for us to create a system or program in which we waive DCs for homes that are actually affordable. Affordable being that 30% of average income for the lower 2/3 of the population, which, if I remember correctly, sits us right now about $300,000 to $350,000. If it's possible to build a house for $300,000 or $350,000, could we do our part and waive the DCs on that unit on a unit by unit basis, like a CIP type of program?
I think we can write that into our bylaw. Any answer on that one?
Just put on the questions.
Sorry, I was half listening to that question because I was looking into
Is
this.
it possible for us to waive the fee on certain types of buildings? That's the question.
Yes, yes, it is, and that can be done a number of ways. So I would note, I think specifically around the question of affordability, the province has mandated exemptions from development charges for units that are deemed to be affordable under certain provincial thresholds. Now, I know those thresholds are quite low. That's the feedback we're getting universally. So that's one mechanism. The municipality does have the ability to introduce exemptions or reductions to the development charge within the development charge bylaw itself. The municipality has done this historically for industrial developments, where industrial developments are exempt from the payment of development charges and have been for many years, as is the case in many municipalities. The other mechanism would be, instead of building it directly into the development charge bylaw, is to provide a grant through a CIP program.
Thank you both. Do you have the answer to the other question? There you go. Any other questions? Well, Peter's looking that up.
I think I won't have a precise answer for you, but just looking at the numbers here. So when we look at the total, sorry, just lost my page here. The total capital costs that are being included in the calculation of the charge for parks and recreation, we have about $3.4 million of capital needs. Of that, the new recreation facility represents $2.7 million of that. So if we removed $2.7 million of the $3.4 million, whatever percentage that is, that's how much the charge would effectively be reduced. So let's say we removed half of the capital costs for sake of an example, then the calculated charge for parks and recreation would go from $5,200 to $2,600. And I think that's, so what we're talking about with if the new recreation facility would be removed, that's about 2/3 of the capital cost, probably a little bit more, that are included in the calculation of the charge. So the calculated rate for parks and recreation of, again, about $5,200 would go down by about 2/3.
So by my calculations, about $4,100 of the $5,200 is going toward, or theoretically going toward, a future multi-use recreational facility. My noodling is correct with my calculator. 41 of the 52. Councillor Wheeldon.
That is a significant portion, but returning to your previous comment, given the state of our current arena, unless we're considering a future in which Brighton has no arena, there's this kind of charge is going to be needed. And are we preparing now for a future without an arena? I'm willing to have that discussion, I guess. But given that we are looking at, I think, are we decided that we're going to have another arena as a, like that there's no Brighton future without an arena? Or how do you feel about that, I guess?
I don't think that's I know it's part and parcel of the discussion tonight because of the value of the DCs toward a new multi-use recreational facility, but I don't think it's the debate we want to have. It's not the debate I'm willing to go down the road of tonight.
Yeah, it was a somewhat rhetorical question because it is in our strategic plan. What is undecided is what exactly that will look like. But even if we're looking at a minimum viable product for an arena, it's going to be tens of millions of dollars. And so I was skeptical coming in as to whether or not we needed to have this DC on, but the mayor's comment reminded me of other issues that we've had already at this table recently about the state of the ice and how early can we have ice in, given the age of our infrastructure. Those kinds of questions are going to happen more and more as the arena continues to age. I think we need to stick with our strategic plan and say, no, we're going to have an arena of some kind.
Councillor Boutwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think some of that is kind of at the crux of where we're all sitting with this multi-use recreation facility. What amenities is it going to include? If we're just going to build a single ice pad with a couple of change rooms, then I think that that's an entirely different conversation, a different animal than if we're going to put an indoor pool and we're going to do the YMCA workout rooms and are we going to include doctors' offices in it? That's clearly a bigger price tag. But until we have an idea of what all of these individual things could potentially look like, collecting money from people, not even knowing what it is exactly we're building that seems very cart before the horse-ish to me.
Councillor Rowley.
Thank you. I think sitting around this table many moons ago, as you did, Mayor, I think there was a time where you could kind of graduate some of these. Is that an option with something like this, instead of maybe starting out today with the 5,200 per unit? If we were to just specifically pick that one.
I think to increase the value, we need to have another study done. Those studies, of course, cost significant money. Mr. Simsisco, could you? And I know annually we're allowed to increase it by the cost of living or whatever it is deemed the appropriate inflationary amount. Mr. Simsisco.
There is the option to phase in the new development charge rates that we do see municipalities doing that from time to time to graduate the increase. That is possible. Something to note, just like with exemptions or a reduction to the development charge, is that any revenue loss that results from that exemption cannot be made up by increasing the charges on other types of development. So any revenue loss resulting from that type of policy would need to come from the tax base or water wastewater rate payers if it's water wastewater related.
So keeping in mind the intent of development charges is that growth pays for growth. What we would be doing is asking the existing taxpayer then to pay for the cost of those things we didn't ask the new residents or new homeowners to, purchasers of new homes to provide for as in those growth estimates. Councillor Boutwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I might be mulling this over on the spot. The average time, roughly, that an individual spends in their home is 7 to 10 years, and that's kind of an average range. We are not very well positioned to have a facility built in 7 years, by my estimation. So when we first came on, we were talking about 2030, which is only 5 years away. And so asking people to pay for things today that in all likelihood are not going to be here in 7 years even, and they're moving on by that point, you know, it flung into my brain. Come back to me. The second one just went out of my head.
Anything further on the motion? Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you, Mayor. No, I've just lost it too. I will say that I think that the intent of the DCs is not necessarily for the specific person who's in the home, but that the home represents represents users of municipal services. So no matter who is there when they move in theory, they will pass on the cost of this to the next buyer as well, because housing rarely goes down in price when it goes from the first buyer to the second buyer. So it's not necessarily that we're asking people to pay for a service that might not be there, but we're asking for the entire capacity of new users of services to be contributing to those services. Now, with regard to the alternative being raising taxes, we're already doing that this year, and we've already invested significant amounts in land banking for the sake of affordable housing. And so around the conversation of wanting to keep things affordable, we have not necessarily shied away from spending tax dollars to support affordable housing as it is. I don't know that I can't, I don't understand the comparative costs of our land banking program spread out over budget years and with our forthcoming business plan for that land as compared to what it would cost us to lower DCs for the hope of affordability. But as a realtor, I know that no matter how low we set DCs, the market value is the market value. And very often, any saving is very difficult for us to make sure that any savings are passed on to consumers. Market value is what it is. And I've certainly seen it more than double in the time that I've been a realtor. So it's difficult for me to say that we're supporting affordable housing by reducing these rates and subsidizing that through taxes that are going to be levied on the very people who are going to be buying those homes anyway. We're moving money around, and the market is going to dictate what the value of that home is anyway. So I don't necessarily see that we're making a big difference for affordability by moving this number. I know it makes a big difference for developers, and I don't want to disregard that. I think it's important for them to have clarified cash flow so that they can continue to build, so that they can continue to invest, so that the number of starts goes up. I think that's really valuable and worth investing in. But when we're talking about end user affordability, I think much of what we do here is moot unless there's a sudden surge of new housing starts. And that's not what we're contemplating today. We're contemplating less than we had last year. So,
Councillor Botwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As Councillor Wheeldon was just stating, it doesn't necessarily affect affordability in the same way. I would say that if we have a home that used to be, these are made up numbers, 408,000, because I think that was we were going from just under 9,000 to 30,000, was it? For urban.
Within the urban areas, going from about 14,300 to
14,000.
29,500.
Okay, so we're essentially doubling the numbers. I think it was 53%, that number's jockeying in my brain.
Right.
So we have a $400,000 home that is then was listed for 415. It's now 430. And when we look at resale properties, those get priced up again. So say you have two properties, one that's built 2 years ago in 2023, they're identical. That pulls the value of that one that's already existing in the marketplace too. So it does affect affordability across the board. When we look at comparing the prices of homes and pricing them and what they sell for against the new build that did have the increased development charges, it drags all of the prices up.
Councillor Wheeldon.
that is if developers are pricing based on cost rather than on market value. And I'm not going to suggest that they're gonna, but I mean, they're gonna try and get top dollar because that's what we do when we sell houses.
Go ahead.
I feel like it's high school and they say rebuttal. We should not be looking to our development community to solve an affordability problem.
Agreed.
And a housing shortage problem. So they will price up against what they feel they can get in consideration of like homes on the market.
Mhm.
And so I would assert that in that increase in price, all those other properties go up in value. They drag those up more than anything. They don't depress them. So why would they sell them out of the goodness of their hearts? There has to be a business case where nobody's going to build.
Go ahead.
I agree, and that's why I think that, you know, even if we manage to make a home $20,000 cheaper, the market rate for that home will remain the same. And so what we're doing then is subsidizing the developer. And I'm not, again, not trying to single out developers here, but that's the way that those equations work. If the market value is $430,000 and we make it this home possible to build at 410, that's not going to mean that they're going to market it at 410. The market value will remain 430. So unless there's some mechanism in saying, okay, if we reduce these DCs, then we need to see that reduction passed on market price or whatever the listing price is for these homes, then we might see that it has an effect to drag down prices across the market. But otherwise, I don't understand how we could make market price go down unless, again, we see a huge influx of new homes on the market. Then market prices would go down.
Councillor Butwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's like watching tennis. So instead of a development charge being levied against the developer who's just going to pass it on to the taxpayer, why on earth are we going through this whole development charge thing? Why don't we just direct bill to the taxpayer? Then it doesn't affect affordability of the home, because it's ugly. And this is a way to kind of increase, we get the money, but we get to hide behind the developer who's forced to bill it to the purchaser.
It's not a Ponzi scheme, though. I mean, let's
No,
not make
but
it
it's
sound like it is.
Well, it does kind of. So I understand where the money's going. The money is going to something good. But why, if the end user who is the purchaser is the one who's going to have to pay it anyways, why are we going, well, I guess because that's the only way to raise the money.
Because we have very limited sources of revenue.
So could the development charge not be levied directly against the property
It is levied against the property.
outside of the selling cost of the home? So that it's,
I think it is levied outside the cost of the home. It's a poll tax, if you will.
no, I understand. Just,
It's a set valued poll tax on a residential property, with the exception of, you know, multi-residential or commercial, which are square footage.
so the only way to keep that $400,000 price tag, if we're using the example of 400, is to just have the development charge piece be part of the closing costs.
And I think there might be value in having a conversation around, you know, should we be looking at exempting development charges on building units that are at a certain value in the market? I'm not sure how we do that or what that looks like. I guess we'd look to the experts to offer that advice to us, which would mean we'd have to hold a special meeting at some point in the next week or so. But I think there's value to have that conversation. If we're talking about attainability in the marketplace and removing or reducing development charges for those attainable houses, you know, an $800,000 home, not attainable, we'll let that one have, you know, full freight DCs. I'm just spitballing here. But you know, if it's 395, then let's forego development charges or half them or what have you. Councillor Wheeldon.
I do want to mention at this point that the Northumberland Intermunicipal Task Force on Housing and Homelessness is hosting an event on the 28th, where we will be having conversations like this about how we can identify the specific points of cost and increase timelines of development, and where we might make policy recommendations. And so I expect that by the end of March, we will have a report with policy recommendations to bring to council.
Thank you for that. Questions or comments on the motion? Go ahead, Councillor Butwell.
just because we keep talking. So I hear that there are some questions about how this is going to work with the MERC. Can that item be pulled out of this report, held back, and then pass on other portions of this development charges report? That makes sense to you?
Mr. Simcisco.
So pulling out which component? With just that one project?
I think we'd be better off to do what I don't want to do, and that's punt it down the road. Rather than just pulling up, rather than playing piecemeal with various potential projects.
I think the only way to do that would be to, on the fly, now adjust the numbers in the bylaw that would be passed. Right,
Yes.
but I think
Yeah.
to your point, there's, we did kick around some numbers to give you an idea of the order of magnitude impact that would have, but we would need to be a lot more specific than that.
Councillor Wright.
We're sort of forgetting in this conversation too, that whether it's the multi-use recreational facility or just an arena, both of those things are coming up one way or the other, and they need to be paid for. So whether it's going to be, say, 15 million for just an arena, or 22 or 30 million, whatever that one turns out to be, it still needs to be paid for as well. So I was really hoping when I asked the question about how much made up that 52.47, I was hoping it was like $41, but no, it's $4,100. So yeah, so I mean, that is going to go towards funding just an arena, if not the Merc. And this one is, out of everything, is absolutely needed, because I don't want to be the politician that says no to the hockey players in this community, because I don't think any of us would survive that. It comes right down to it.
And I don't want to be the politician that just says yes to an arena and be short-sighted about the other things that this community needs from a recreational perspective. And I don't know if that's a pool. I don't know if that's an indoor walking track. I don't know what that is, and that's why we have a task force that's going to look into that stuff for us. But I'd be surprised if we don't have something ready to go in 5 to 7 years. I would be surprised. That's typically true, Councillor Rowley. Councillor Wright.
And here's also hoping that there's another grant that we can play
Well.
into.
Yeah, here. Councillor Boutwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with former director Miller, Jim Miller, where we talked about the potential costs of this type of facility. And he was very much in this conversation, he wasn't for or against anything. He was saying, yes, absolutely, we need it, but we've reached a time where we can't just look for our government and our taxpayer to just pay through their taxes or these types of user fees, that there's actually going to have to be some engagement in the community for fundraising and that kind of thing. So I just thought I would put that out there, that if the community is going to want some things, then we're going to have to, as a whole and as a community, put some boots on the ground and do some fundraising and do some of our own legwork, because we can't just keep raising money through all of these mechanisms only. It becomes cumbersome for everybody. So putting that out there came to mind.
Agreed. Councillor Wheeldon.
Along those lines, always very exciting to be at a conference, as I was last week, that is sponsored by an organization with $2.6 billion grant funding available for things including major projects like recreation facilities, so long as they are built in towards sustainable goals, which of course we want to encourage in this community anyway. So I had great conversations with people talking about affordable, sustainable housing, but also things like arenas, pools, things like that. Funding exists for these things. And I've got 4 different people from the Green Municipal Fund who said they're going to follow up with me this week or next week. So there are opportunities for funding for these things. That said, we can't always depend on it. And so we need to, I think, lay the groundwork for at least having a fund available to break ground so that we can have that arena in 5 to 7 years, and hope we can pick up funding along the way. I think if we defer these types of costs until we know for sure all of the details of the project, we're going to end up suddenly ramping up DCs in the future to try and make up the difference and ramping up taxes in the future to try and make up the difference, regardless of how much fundraising we do. I think this is the way that we can set a foundation for this project and make sure that we can move forward when the time strikes.
Look forward to hearing how those conversations go. I spent 6 years begging for money from our provincial friends. I got 35 million, so over to you. CAO.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I think I just want to be clear from a staff's perspective that we wouldn't recommend punting this down the road and delaying the bylaw. We talk about the revenues that need to be collected to be able to continue providing the services we provide. And if you look at slide 8, currently we are the lowest in Northumberland County. And I don't want to upset my developer friends. They've enjoyed that rate for a long period of time. And, we talk about how much development is happening in this community, and one of the largest growing municipalities. We have to be able to recover some of that revenue to be able to continue to provide the resources we have. So as soon as we delay this again, with every home that we have, we're missing out on that additional funding, which, we probably should have had in place some time ago. So I know it's a large increase. It appears to be significant, and it is, but I think it's reflected in the amount that we currently are sitting at with our development charges. We certainly will look at continued grant funding, and if we are successful with the CHIF funding, I'd be more than happy to recommend that we reopen this bylaw and go through the process again. I think Mr. Simcisco said that there was some opportunities outside of the bylaw that we could look at for affordable housing, and we can continue to have that conversation and bring it back. And then the arena, we currently have that committee. We are very close to issuing that RFP for the feasibility study, and hopefully we will have that back before the end of the year.
So may I suggest that we add something to this resolution that directs staff to provide us with some options with regard to affordable, attainable housing as it relates to development charges? Is that something that staff could do for us and come back within a month? Because we can reopen it and tinker with it at that point. Is that, Councillor Wright is the mover, is that something you would consider? Councillor Rowley is the seconder? What I've written, Councillor Wright, is then further direct staff to provide council with recommendations around affordable, attainable housing options as it relates to DCs. Councillor Rowley? CAO, does that make sense, what I'm asking? Anything further from members of council? Councillor Wheeldon?
Does this bylaw specify at which point, and forgive me, there's a lot of details here. Does this bylaw specify at which point in the development process DCs are charged?
Mr. Simcisco?
Generally speaking, yes, it does set that out. Generally speaking, development charges are calculated and become payable at building permit issuance. There is a clause within the bylaw that provides council with the ability to enter into early or deferred payment agreements on a case-by-case basis. There are also some statutory requirements under the Development Charges Act that change the timing of payment. So for example, for institutional developments, they don't pay their full development charge at the time of building permit issuance. They pay in 6 annual installments. And then for developments that proceed through a site plan application or a zoning bylaw amendment, the development charges that they ultimately pay are based on the rates that were in effect when that planning application was submitted to the municipality. So even though building permit might be a couple of years out, the rates that they're paying based on are frozen in time effectively.
Thank you. That does answer my question. I have heard feedback from the development community that even deferring them to the time of them selling the home greatly improves their cash flow and results in less money going toward the lenders that are supporting their development.
Thank you for that, Councillor Wright.
two things. One, can we put an end date on the request for that information from staff just to, so that it comes back to us in due course and doesn't drift into ether?
Sure. Can I ask the CEO what a reasonable timeline
Yeah.
would be?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, could I ask Mr. Simcisco what a reasonable time would be for us to get together and have those discussions and present something back to council?
I think we can probably have those discussions, look at other municipal best practices in that regard, other municipalities that have implemented maybe similar programs. I would say we can be back within a month.
So the first meeting in April, does that make sense for a report? Does that work for you?
Yes.
Councilor Wright.
And two, further to Councillor Wheeldon's comment, I wouldn't mind seeing some of the charges deferred until the house is sold, things that don't necessarily impact the building right away, things like the park and rec services, library services, services related to public health and growth related studies. Those could be deferred to the point of sale. Services related to highway and fire protection services, I would think would be more upfront just because you want your firemen to take care of a burning house, regardless if it's in the stage of building or fully completed. So those kinds of things I think could be potentially deferred.
I would anticipate our fire department would take care of a burning building no matter when we collect the development charge. CEO.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to council. Director Walsh and I have already had conversations about a policy coming forward to defer development charges, and it certainly was something that the development community had expressed an interest in. So I'm not sure of his timeline, but he certainly is looking at some other municipalities for that type of policy to bring back to council.
Great, thank you.
Director Walsh, could we ask what your timeline is on that? That's my curiosity now. Apologies for
To the
putting
Mayor
you on
and
the spot.
Council, in our senior manager team meeting this morning, I think on the list was an April date. So it coincides with council's interest and prioritization.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Do we need to or want to include that in this motion? Director Walsh, if I put that policy is to come to council for the April planning meeting, is that enough time?
I believe that's April 17th. No?
No, it's the one before that.
Okay. Yeah, I can make it happen, I think, because I do have a draft policy to work with from another municipality. But with the help of Mr. Simcisco, I'm sure we can get it done. I'm assuming he has a gap in his calendar perhaps, but
So Councilor Wright is the mover. I've added in further direct staff to draft a policy for the deferral of DCs to be brought to council at the April council planning meeting. Does that work? Councilor Rowley is a seconder. Anything else we want to add to this? Want to direct staff to order lunch or anything? It's getting there. I'm on the other side now. CAO.
I'm sorry. Through you, Mr. Mayor, maybe we could have those come at the same meeting, just in case we need Mr. Simcisco to be here. It might be beneficial for him only to have to attend once.
So fair enough. If we write, okay, is that going to be possible for you to bring it to the first meeting in April? Oh, I see. You want, so we'll push them both to planning. Does that work for, okay. Clerk, if you need any help deciphering this, I'll be around on Thursday. Anything further from members of council? I've just changed the April first meeting in April to April's planning meeting, and I'll read the whole thing again if everybody wants. And just for Councilor Wright and Councilor Rowley's information, because you did sign this before the dates were amended, the DC background study happened on June 13th, not June 3rd. And the public meeting was held on July 15th, not June 3rd. So we've changed those dates as well. Anything further before? I'm going to read it again. It's moved by Councilor Wright, seconded by Councilor Rowley. Whereas Council received the DC background study on June 13th, 2024, and held a public meeting on July 15th, 2024, and whereas additional consultation was afforded to and comments were provided by the development community. Now therefore be it resolved that Council receive and approve without any further public meetings the Brighton 2024 DC background study and DC addendum as presented this evening by Peter Simsisko, Watson and Associates. And further direct staff to provide Council with recommendations around affordable attainable housing options as it relates to DCs at the April 2025 Council Planning meeting. And further direct staff to draft a policy for the deferral of DCs to be brought to Council at the April 2025 Council Planning meeting. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Could I have a recorded vote, please?
You may. Madam Clerk, a recorded vote has been requested by Councilor Rowley.
Councillor Emily Rowley,
Yes.
Councillor Jeff Wielden,
Yes.
Councillor Bobby Wright,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Ron Anderson,
Yes.
Councillor Ann Butwell,
Yes.
Councillor Hannah McCausland,
Yes.
Mayor Brian Ostrander,
Yes,
and that's carried.
thank you. Our next presentation is from Peter Simsisko. Mr. Simsisko, would you like a break before you go into your next presentation?
I'm okay.
Very well.
Thank
Our
you.
next presentation is from Peter Simsisko with regard to water and wastewater fees and charges. Mr. Simsisko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we can, I think, jump right into this one if we can go to the next slide. So Watson and Associates were retained by the municipality to help prepare a water and wastewater rate study. That rate study is also accompanied by a water financial plan, which is under separate cover, but also included within the agenda package. That water financial plan is really just a translation of the water wastewater rate study into the prescribed format under Regulation 45307. That regulation specifies that these water financial plans must be prepared and submitted as part of the application package for drinking water license renewal. So it is a critical component, critical document in securing the renewal of that license. So the rate study update was undertaken with specific regard for several items as listed on the slide here. Specifically, we looked at the customer profile, so the customers that are connected to the water and wastewater systems, look at recent consumption patterns. We also updated the growth forecast based on the recently completed development charges background study to get a sense of how that customer profile might change in the coming years. We then looked at the capital needs of the water and wastewater services. So we looked at all the infrastructure assets that support the provision of water wastewater services, looked at what their longer-term life cycle funding needs are, as well as looked at what specific capital expenditures the municipality is expecting over the next 10 years. And then similar to the capital, we also looked at the operating costs, the operating budgets, and looked at what those might look like over our forecast period. As well. I would note that the last water wastewater rate study that the municipality completed was back in 2017. Typically, those studies are updated on about a 5-year cycle. So it is timely to bring this forward at this point in time. On the next slide, we have an illustration of the overall methodology that we follow when undertaking this type of rate study. I'll just go through this at a high level. There are really three kind of key elements to this. On the left-hand side, you'll see the reference to a growth forecast, and down below that to the user count and profile. So again, we're really trying to get an understanding of what the current customer base looks like, both in terms of number of customers that are connected to these systems, but as well as how much water they're consuming, because that's a part of the bill that they received is based on metered water consumption as well. So we need to have a good handle on both of those factors. Then we're looking at what is the anticipated growth within the municipality. For this rate study, we're looking at a 10-year growth forecast. And so that growth in customers has been based on the development charges study growth forecast that's within the development charges background study. And I'll speak in a little bit more detail about how we determined the additional consumption that's likely to be generated by that growth as well. So that gives us the customers and consumption. Going back to the top of the illustration, we have various capital works requirements. These can be driven by the life cycle needs of existing infrastructure as it ages and requires repair or replacement. In some cases, it's driven by growth and the need to expand, particularly within the municipality's wastewater system. There are some significant growth driven expenditures there as well. And we're both looking at, again, the shorter to medium term needs. So what are the specific capital investments that we're expecting the municipality to need to make over the next 10 years, but also looking at the longer term needs of that infrastructure. So recognizing that a lot of the infrastructure, these assets that support water, wastewater services are long lived. We need to look at the full life cycle of those assets to determine their life cycle costs and how much money we should be putting away to facilitate the eventual replacement and renewal of those assets. So this incorporates really asset management planning concepts into the rate study. With those capital works requirements identified, we're then also looking at operating costs and how those are expected to change over the forecast period as well, which can be driven by similar factors in terms of system expansion. We're looking at whether there's any planned expansion to staffing levels or other assets that are coming online. And so once we have a good understanding of the total costs to operate the systems, we then look at that relative to the customer profile and the total amount of consumption to be able to calculate rates that would generate sufficient revenues to support the sustainable provision of water and wastewater services into the future. So that's the general methodology that we follow. In the presentation, I'll go through kind of the specifics of each of those elements. So on the next slide, we have a quick summary of the rates that are currently in effect. The municipality has historically used a very common rate structure, I would say, which has two components to it. There's a monthly base charge that applies. On the residential side, that monthly base charge is applied based on the number of units that are serviced by a meter. Up to our non-residential customers, the monthly base charge varies based on the meter size. So that's captured in the top part of the table. And then in addition to those monthly base charges, that are also consumptive rates that get applied to the metered consumption that flows through a water meter. And so again, the summary of the current rates is on the slide here. I would note here that these rates have been in effect since 2023. So there was no change to the rates for 2024, and those rates remain in effect as of today. So on the next slide, we have a summary of the growth forecast. So we reviewed detailed billing records from the past several years to get an idea of what that current customer base looks like. The municipality currently has, or as of the end of 2024, had about 3,530 water customers and about 3,430 wastewater customers. What we are then doing is converting those customers into billable units, recognizing that practice that residential customers are charged based on the number of units that are serviced, not necessarily based on the building. And so this chart, or at least the bars in this chart, show that, the lines rather, show the number of billable units that exist within the water and wastewater systems. And you'll see that we're forecasting the number of billing units to increase by about 58 or close to 60 per year. So that's based on that residential growth forecast that we discussed earlier as part of the development charges study. So again, we're expecting a growth of about 60 new customers per year connecting to the systems. And then what you see illustrated with the bars is the chargeable amount of water consumption for both water customers and wastewater customers. So we know that there are somewhat fewer wastewater customers, so somewhat less billable water consumption that gets charged out to those customers as well. In terms of coming up with that forecast of future consumption levels or demand levels, we analyze trends around what the current average consumption is per billable unit. And we see that is around 162 cubic meters per billable unit. So what we've done is in coming up with the forecast, applied that average consumption of 162 cubic meters per unit to the forecasted number of additional units that are being connected to the water wastewater systems over that 10-year period. If we can go to the next slide, then we'll look at a summary of the vast amount of infrastructure that is in place and that supports the provision of water wastewater services. To inform this, we looked to the municipality's 2022, I believe it was, asset management plan, which looked at both the quantities as well as the replacement costs of the infrastructure assets supporting these services. Recognizing that that asset management plan is now a few years old, we did adjust the replacement cost by inflationary indexes, and the current estimates are that the water infrastructure has a replacement cost value of just under $80 million, and then the wastewater infrastructure has a combined replacement cost of about $76 million. And why those numbers are important is recognizing that every piece of infrastructure, whether it's a pipe in the ground, whether it's a hydrant, whether it's a facility, is going to require repair, rehabilitation, and replacement at some point. We need to understand the full life cycle costs or the average annual life cycle costs of these assets. And that's what you see illustrated in the circle in the bottom middle of the slide. Based on that replacement cost valuation and based on the typical life expectancies of these assets, that average annual life cycle cost is about $2.1 million between water and wastewater combined. So another way to look at that, that's the rate of annual consumption of that infrastructure portfolio. And that's a key number because it forms a target in terms of how much capital funding we need to build into the rates for them to be sustainable over the full lifespan of these various assets. So again, $2.1 million based on current estimates. What we also then recognized, and this is summarized on the next slide, is that infrastructure portfolio is going to grow over the next 10 years quite significantly, particularly with the expansion upgrades to the wastewater treatment system. There's a new trunk sewer main that's proposed within the development charges study, a couple of additional vehicles, one in water, one in wastewater, a new booster pumping station, significantly more expensive than the current one that's proposed to facilitate growth as well. And so when we look to the end of our forecast period to 2034 and adjusting for inflation as well as adjusting for these additional assets that the municipality will construct and become responsible for, that annual life cycle cost and therefore funding target by 2034 is going to be about $4.6 million. And so this is something important to keep in mind, is that going back to our previous discussion around development charges, the development charge pays for the initial acquisition of an asset. But after that point, the ongoing maintenance, renewal, rehabilitation, replacement of that asset is something that we need to fund through rates. And so that's why we can take those considerations into account when designing rates that are financially sustainable. So that's the outlook to 2034 in terms of overall funding targets. The next couple of slides look at the specific capital needs that have been identified for the next 10 years. On slide 7 here, we are looking at the capital expenditure forecast for water services. As you can see, there are more significant needs in the first 5 years of the forecast, tapering off somewhat in the outer years of the forecast. But as an annual average over the next 10 years, the capital expenditures related to water services are going to average about $1.3 million. We are then also looking relative to those average costs, what is our funding target? And that's illustrated with the dotted horizontal line across the chart. So that's based on the, again, extent of infrastructure and based on the typical life cycles. What is the sustainable level of funding for these assets over that longer term? And that's been estimated at about $1.1 million. And then the final component is to look at how much capital funding is provided within the current rates. So when we look at how much how much revenue your current water and wastewater rates are generating. Once we net off operating costs, how much money is left over for capital, either specific expenditures or potentially contributions to a capital lifecycle reserve to offset future needs. And that's illustrated with a little dot, I guess, on the left of the chart. So that current capital funding capacity is about $980,000. So that indicates that within water, at least, the average annual life cycle funding requirements are about 90% funded. So that's a relatively small annual funding gap that currently exists. And with the forecast that we've prepared, which I'll share shortly, that funding gap would be closed by the end of the 10-year forecast period. On the next slide, we have a similar picture. The scale is quite different here due to the wastewater system upgrades and expansion. Over the next 10 years, we are expecting average annual expenditures of about $5.1 million. But as you can see in the chart, a lot of that is very front-end heavy with particularly the wastewater treatment upgrades and expansion that are expected to be completed over the next couple of years. In terms of that longer-term funding requirement, again illustrated with the dotted line going across the chart, that average annual funding target as of right now is about $975,000 per year. Of course, that's going to grow by the end of the forecast period. And that's about 49% funded currently when we look at, again, the budgeted revenues for 2025 based on the rates that are currently in effect. There would be about $478,000 available for capital-related items within the revenues that the current rates would produce. So again, there is a funding gap that currently exists on the capital side, and the forecast that's been developed would close that over the next 10 years to put the municipality in a fully financially sustainable position at that point in time. So then on the next slide, we're summarizing those capital expenditures and the sources of funding, importantly, for those capital expenditures. So you'll see that between water and wastewater combined in the very bottom row of the table, there's about $67.8 million of total capital expenditures that we expect the municipality to incur over the next 10 years. Again, a significant amount of that is related to the wastewater system upgrades and expansion, part of which would be offset by grant funding. So you'll see that of the $67.8 million, there's about $35 million of grant funding that's been identified and built into the forecast. We are expecting the municipality to need to take on some additional external borrowing or debt to finance some of these expenditures as well. And so debt would pay for about 28% of the $67.8 million forecasted for the 10-year period. The Development Charges Reserve Fund would pay for about 3.8% of these needs because some of them are growth related. And then the final item is the Capital Reserve Fund, which would cover about $10.3 million of these expenditures, which represents about 15%. And as is illustrated in the kind of separated column off to the right, with the capital funding plan that's been prepared, we would expect the municipality to have an additional $1.4 million of annual debt servicing costs by the end of the forecast period. And again, some of that would be paid for by development charge revenues, but some of that is going to hit the rates as well. So that's the capital side. On the next slide, we have a summary of how the operating budget forecast was developed. To do this, we looked to the municipality's 2025 operating budget. We worked through that kind of line by line to see if any specific adjustments were required, but generally that operating budget is being indexed with inflationary indexes, so at about 2.3% per year over the forecast period. And so that sees the water operating expenditures increasing from about $1.4 million in 2025 to about $1.7 million by 2034. And on the wastewater side, the operating costs we expect to increase from about $1.6 million currently to about $2 million per year by 2034. We have also built the capital-related expenditures, so specifically the principal and interest payments on any additionally incurred debt over the forecast period into the funding plan as well. So if we can go to the next slide, we have an illustration summarizing the overall kind of financial forecast for water services. What you see illustrated with the bars are the total expenditures in each year. The bottom part of each bar shows the capital, or sorry, my apologies, the operating expenditures. The smaller portion of each stacked bar represents the debt servicing cost of principal and interest payments that we're expecting the municipality to have to make in each year. And then the final component of the bars is the green, the upper portion, which represents the capital expenditures. So again, the total sum of all those components of the bars represents the total expenditures in each year. And then what we're showing with the black upward sloping line are the revenues that have been forecasted to support and to pay for these expenditures over that period. And I'll show you what that translates into in terms of rates shortly. So this is showing how we're expecting total revenues to be secured over that period. And what we also recognize is that in some years, the revenues and what's available in reserves is not going to be enough to offset the full extent of the expenditures. And those are years like if you look at 2027, for example, where we would expect the municipality to have to take on some additional external debt to make up the difference. We do also expect that this plan would generate just under $5 million in reserves by the end of the forecast period, which would then be available to offset any future capital needs as well. A similar picture, again, slightly different or very different scale rather here for wastewater services, again, showing the full extent of expenditures we're forecasting for each year with the very significant capital expenditures in 2025 and 2026, showing that certainly rate revenues in those years would not be enough to offset those expenditures. So we are expecting some grant funding and also some additional debt to be incurred to finance those capital expenditures. But similar to what we saw with water, with the rate forecast that has been developed, that would allow for some accumulation of money in capital reserves by the end of the forecast period of just over $5 billion by 2034. So in terms of then looking at the specific rates that would be able to generate those revenues that were illustrated in those charts, what we're looking at here on slide 13 is the full rate forecast. I know there are a lot of numbers on this page. We'll look at what this means in terms of a typical ratepayer and the impact on their bill shortly. But I want to highlight a couple of few things here. So firstly, at the top, we have the rates applicable to water services with the very top part of the table showing the consumptive rates that are applied to metered water consumption. And you'll see that those are proposed to increase at about 2.3% per year. Starting on April 1st of this year and into 2034. So again, a 2.3% annual increase to the consumptive rate. Down below that, we see the monthly base charges applicable to water services. And again, the specific charge varies by meter size. However, we are proposing those monthly base charges to increase at 3.3% annually over the next 10 years. And so that really on the water side is mainly just keeping pace with inflationary pressures. So as we noted earlier, there doesn't appear to be a big funding gap on the capital side, which is a good news story, certainly. There isn't a lot of catch-up that needs to be played there. We are really forecasting rates to mostly keep pace with inflationary pressures, but also recognizing that there is going to be an expanded asset portfolio that the municipality is going to have by 2034 as well. When we look at the wastewater side, the picture's somewhat different. In terms of the consumptive rate for wastewater, we're forecasting those to increase at 4.6% per year over the forecast period. And in terms of the monthly base charge rates, those are forecasted to increase at just over 15% for the next 3 increases to 2027. And then at about 9.8% per year from 2028 onwards. And the reason why we're seeing the rate impacts being more significant on the wastewater side is twofold. One is there's a larger capital funding gap that exists within wastewater services, where, as I mentioned earlier, about 50% of the annual capital funding requirements are being met currently. So we're looking to close that gap. And then secondly, with the new expanded upgraded wastewater treatment system, there are going to be much higher life cycle costs of that once that comes online as well. And so most of that is hitting the base charge component, which is really tailored to help offset any capital related costs of services. So then what we wanted to look at on the next slide is how was this expected to impact the average residential customer. As mentioned earlier, the average customer is consuming about 160 cubic meters per year. So when we look at the sum up the monthly base charges that they would be faced with, as well as the annual consumptive rates based on that level of consumption, we are illustrating what that total water and wastewater bill would be in each year. Again, for 2023 and 2024, that bill would have been about $1,070 for the year for water, wastewater combined. As mentioned earlier, rates didn't change from 23 to 24, so that bill would have remained the same. Assuming that the new rates that have been proposed would come into effect as of April 1st of this year, the impact to that same customer's bill would be about a 4.5% increase relative to what they paid for water, wastewater services in 2024. So that's about a $48 increase for the year, or about $4 per month in 2025 relative to 2024. There is then about a 7.5% increase forecasted for 2026, going to about $1,200 for the year in 2026 between water and wastewater combined, and then so on. So you see that that annual year-over-year increase stabilizes around 5.2, 5.3% for the remainder of the forecast period. The reason why the increases are somewhat larger in the initial years, if we can go to the next slide, just wanted to illustrate that there were further increases that were recommended within the 2017 rate study. If those rate increases were implemented, and I believe they were implemented up until 2024, but in 2024, there was a pause put on those increases. So the bills would actually be, as illustrated on this chart, somewhat higher. So for 2025, for example, that bill would be about $1,120 versus the $1,071 that it is based on the rates that are currently in effect. So what's happening, why I wanted to illustrate this, is we are playing a little bit of catch up and not out of line with what was forecasted back in 2017. But that's why the increases are somewhat more pronounced in the initial 2 to 3 years of the forecast. So that's the forecasted impact on the average residential customer on the chart here. The final chart is a comparison similar to what we looked at with development charges, looking at what the typical water, wastewater bills are in other area municipalities for that same hypothetical residential customer consuming 160 cubic meters of water annually. As you'll see, the municipality, based on the rates that are currently in effect, is towards the lower end of that range that we see in other municipalities. And with the increase that's been proposed, if again that takes effect on April 1st, the municipality would certainly still be well within the range of water, wastewater bills that customers see in other area municipalities. So that summarizes the impacts. Just in terms of next steps, we are asking council to consider approval of the water wastewater rate study, as well as approval of the water wastewater rates that are presented in table 6-1 of the study, and as presented in the presentation here today. That will then require staff to come forward with an updated water and wastewater fees and charges bylaw that will actually implement those rates. And then we are also asking council to consider approval of the water financial plan, which is based on the rate study that's in front of you, which will then need to be submitted as part of the license renewal requirements. And so that summarizes the formal part of the presentation. At least I'd certainly be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you again, Mr. Simsisco. Questions of clarification, members of council. Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you, Mayor and Mr. Simsisco. You mentioned a funding gap on wastewater. Was that gap forecast and a previous council decided not to prepare for that? Or is that a result of that 2024 pause that you had mentioned? Or did that gap develop before we were doing this kind of study and we've just been playing catch up all along? How does the gap happen?
So I think it's a little bit of all of the above, right? So there certainly was a funding gap identified when we completed the 2017 rate study. The plan at that point was to close the gap over 10 years, right? Now, pausing the rate increases in 2024 did put us a little bit behind the plan. But that's not the only factor. To be fair, and this happens from time to time as the value of the infrastructure gets reassessed and the needs of that infrastructure get reassessed, as happened with the 2022 asset management plan, that gives us a better sense of what the longer term funding requirements are. And just with the way that cost escalation has worked over that period, updated inventories of the infrastructure, this is the best estimate at this point in time.
Thank you both. Anyone else? I have a motion moved by Councillor Wright. Thank you, Mr. Simsisco again. I have a motion moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that Council receive the Brighton 2025 water and wastewater rate study and approve the water financial plan as presented by Peter Simsisco, Watson and Associates. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. Thank you for your time this evening. It's appreciated. Need a break? No? Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm just wondering, and maybe before Mr. Simsisco goes, part of your recommendations in the report, it does include a motion to approve the water wastewater rates presented in table 6.1 and direct staff to prepare a bylaw. I think it's probably beneficial if we have that as a motion as well. I'm not as concerned about submitting to the ministry. We already have direct orders that has to be done by the end of February. I've assured them they'll have it. But I think we probably should have a motion for the other.
So a motion that council approve the water and wastewater rates presented in table 6-1 and direct staff to prepare and bring forward a new water and wastewater fees and charges bylaw for adoption. Is there a mover? Is there a fourther? It's moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Wright. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Madam Clerk, I've said that council and then see bullet 2. Okay? How long is your presentation, do you figure? I'm going to take a 10-minute recess before we go into the public meeting with regard to the budget presentation. It is 8:16. It is 8:17 p.m. We're recessed until 8:27. It is 8:27 PM. I'm going to call this meeting back to order. Thank you, everyone, and we'll move into our budget presentation. This is a public meeting under the Municipal Act. So we do have one public meeting regarding the presentation of the 2025 budget. The purpose is to request a decision from council on the proposed 2025 budget. CAO Arthurs, can you please explain the legislative requirements under the Act for the passing of the budget and the processes undertaken by council to date?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. Section 290 of the Municipal Act states for each year, a local municipality shall in the year or the immediately preceding year, prepare and adopt a budget, including estimates of all sums required during the year for the purpose of the municipality. Tonight, we will review the 2025 budget timelines and the steps that council has taken to date to get us to this point, as well as the factors that staff utilize to prepare the budget annually.
Thank you. CAO Arthurs, would you please take us through the budget and the results from council's deliberations?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to council. Absolutely. Go to the next slide. So presentation overview of tonight's budget presentation will include the background on Brighton's budget, so including the guidelines that were received, the timelines, the changes from our first draft, the challenges, opportunities, and pressures that we experienced. We'll take you through the tax process and the tax rate, understanding the rate, the levy, and the blended rate. The impact to the taxpayer based on a assessed value of $400,000 and some comparisons with our other neighboring municipalities. We'll take you through the budget expenditures, capital and operating expenditures, the breakdown, the increases by department, the user-supported and tax-supported budgets and those differences, and ultimately where your taxes go. So the highlights of the key projects being completed by department and using the 2025 allocated funds. Next slide. Thank you. So Brighton's budget guidelines are the factors that staff have taken into account when preparing their budgets. So clearly we look for council direction and we capture that throughout the year as we recognize council's priorities and the initiatives that they're requesting. In addition, usually towards the end of the year as we're preparing, council often moves things to budget discussions and has specific motions to address those things, and we've included those in the budget as well. The strategic planning initiatives, your strategic plan was adopted in 2023, and just recently council did receive an update on those initiatives, and we talked then about some of those items that have been captured in this budget as well. And the other guidelines, if we can go to the next slide. These guidelines were pulled from a report that was received by council in the fall of last year, providing some guidelines on what we were looking at as we prepared this budget. I won't go through all of them, but ultimately we were looking to provide an increase to maintain the current service delivery review, the financial strategy for the future wastewater treatment plant, which we weren't even aware we had the funding at that time. So nice that we have that confirmation. The business plan for the land banking initiatives, a financial plan for the community improvement plan, and a financial strategy for the fire and land ambulance building construction. Next slide, please. Our budget timeline, so we began on January the 15th with your original capital budget deliberations. Subsequently, we came back January 29th with the operating budget presentations and deliberations. On February 7th, we had our all-day session where we looked at some of the external budget requests, additional deliberations over the operational and capital budget. This evening, we have our public presentation of the 2025 budget and then looking for council direction to come back with that bylaw on March the 3rd. So the original draft that we brought forward on that January 15th date reflected a 7.67% increase. It did not include the grants and aid, which was already established at 1.5% of your 2024 budget for a total of $183,605. That included would have been a 9.13% increase. We made some changes from that first draft. There was some inclusions, software expenditures, the grants and aid we put back in so that it was reflected, the health services building, the summer students, economic development and capital infrastructure, the CIP, the Trenton Memorial Hospital Foundation contribution, and the Rain Barrel program. Some of the reductions was the deferral of the William Street project, the removal of the new furniture for the council chambers, and then some minor adjustments throughout each department to bring the rates down. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges and opportunities that we experienced, certainly the wages and benefit costs due to the grid increases, and that was primarily due to the negotiations and the collective agreement that was ratified. Those costs had to be incorporated for both the union and then the non-union groups. Some additional public works training for succession planning, some additional training in the fire department, and the renewal of rolling stock to reduce the maintenance cost and downtime. Certainly some large capital projects as well. So the opportunities, we were lucky enough to receive some additional OMPF funding in the amount of $209,400. The decrease in bank rates will allow for some better long-term funding opportunities, some modernization funding from projects that were projects that were deferred, the phase-in approach on the OPP increase, and the flexibility on the internal debt payments. So this chart here just captures the first draft with the inclusion of the grants and aids. So you'll notice the 9.13 at the bottom. It also identifies some of those external pressures, which are sometimes difficult for us to control, including the Conservation Authority, policing, the Police Services Board, transit, and the library. The internal pressures, the service delivery increases related to medical expenses, which again is primarily through that collective agreement and some of those benefit changes that were made. Insurance committee, parks maintenance and staffing, internal department capital and operating expenditures, and then your grants and aid. So we go through the roles in the tax process. Ultimately, the Government of Ontario establishes the province's assessment and taxation laws and determines your education rates. MPAC then determines the property assessments. The municipality determines the revenue requirements, sets the tax rate, and collects the taxes. And the property owner ultimately is paying the taxes and also pays into the education for elementary and secondary schools. Understanding the tax rate, the tax levy includes the three levy components. So one being education, and we've been lucky enough over the last few years to see a 0% increase in that section. The county level, which they have already adopted their budget as 6.12%, and then the municipal level as set by council. So each year, the municipality determines the tax levy, which is the amount that we need to raise in order to be able to continue to deliver those services. So you'll recognize here in the highlighted area that the levy for 2025 is $13,544,749, reflective of a budget increase of just over 1.3. The 2024 growth is the assessment growth that was recognized in 2024 and will be received in 2025. So we reduced the amount by $320,423 for an overall tax increase of $984,009. The percentage of your tax increase and your budget increase are there to the left. So most importantly, I think that 1% tax increase is $125,607. How the municipal levy is calculated. This one is a little bit difficult and to try to make sense of based on the weighted value. So your assessment and then your allocated rates based on your tax class are weighted. So ultimately in the scenario here, we're showing the tax rate and then the assessment of value of all properties to give you the increase of your municipal levy. The blended rate, once we have the municipal levy calculated, we combine it with the education and the county to create your blended rate. So essentially for every dollar, 10 cents is going to education, 39 cents is going to the county, and 51 cents is going to the municipality. So when we take those amounts and multiply them by the tax rate, ultimately we're looking at a 6.3% increase. If you flip to the next slide, you'll notice again that weighted value will reflect a 6.24% residential increase. So the impact on a $400,000 home, right now you're looking at $6,174.51. Okay. 2024 municipal tax comparison. Should probably be 2025. should it be? 2024 with the increase? Oh, you're showing this, sorry, my apologies. We've got the current and then the 2025 rate there, and the other municipalities reflected to show where we sit in those amounts. So our total expenditures, you'll notice here environmental services takes up quite a large portion. And again, that's due to our wastewater treatment facility, and fire services, which is due to the new hall. Public works, certainly a significant amount, policing and general government, and the balance making up the difference. Next slide. Broken down by the operating expenditure, again, you see the large amount in environmental services. Public works takes a broader piece of the pie, general government, again, policing and fire. The operating expenditures are split out a little bit more evenly, but still heavily weighted in those areas. Your capital expenditures definitely heavily weighted in your environmental services, public works, and fire services, at least for the year 2025. So your budget increases by department based on the last deliberations of council, identifies what the increases per department to get us to that 7.61%. And if we take that and we were to go back to the blended rate, we used that rate to calculate your 6.24 weighted residential rate. Thank you. So your user supported, basically the budgets that are supported individually by your users. So your water and your wastewater reflected here does show you the breakdown of the operating, the capital, the grants, and then the fees and charges. Your tax supported on the next slide. Again, you're operating your capital, where we have the grant supported initiatives, the internal and external borrowing, and the tax supported fees and charges, and the levy. So ultimately, where do your taxes go? Again, if you look at that, that county amount of 38.6%, rounded up to 39, your education at 9.9, and the balance just over 50% being municipal, broken down by the services. It's important to note, though, that within that municipal portion, we're covering those policing costs, we're covering the Conservation Authority and those other external agencies. So if we go on to the key projects as identified in the budget, starting with fire, the capital projects and the equipment replacement, bunker gear, protective services, or personal protective equipment, hose and nozzle replacements, two-way radios, defibrillator, and then a new truck. The capital projects, upgrades to Station 2, primarily done last year, just some minor things that are being completed, and the heavy weighted one is the new fire and paramedic station. Next slide.
CA, you might want to go back one.
Did I miss one?
Yeah. To key projects, general government.
Oh, that's where I was. Okay, so under the general government, again, we talked about that centralization location that's accessible for the general public to come in and having that customer service desk there. The updates to the website to enhance, again, the accessibility and usability and communication for residents. The integration of documents and records management software, which, you know, it's not one of those things that council will see the benefit of right away, but it's certainly something that helps our processes internally. And the upgrade to the generator at the municipal office. Operating projects, that shared position between the clerks and finance that will manage that front counter, the reception, the cash handling, and the commissioner of oath services. Moving on to the public works. Capital projects, again, with the building upgrades, alarm systems, office renovations at 67 Sharp, trying to maximize some of the office space there to accommodate for staff that we have. The demolition of 21 Kingsley. Purchase of guide rails for enhanced safety, again, something that's ongoing annually that we include. New equipment, including a pickup truck, sweeper attachment, sander, tandem, and a single axle truck. Road construction, there's a number that have been identified for single surface treatment and double surface treatment. sidewalk improvements, and the culvert study and structural evaluation on Whites Road. Key projects for Parks and Rec, the capital projects, including that multi-purpose recreational facility development study and business plan. So we have that feasibility study that we're going to put out very soon. The arena upgrades, including some glass replacement, the ice plant, rubber flooring, and the ice resurfacer. Capital projects, including parks and trails, Wallace Street, replacing the maintenance equipment, safety fencing for King Edward, which I believe is our pickleball. Is that our fencing? Yeah. Security cameras, software, signage upgrades, trail construction and renovations. The operational staffing, we're looking at hiring a full-time supervisor halfway through the year to assist our manager of Parks and Rec with some of the staffing there and allow her to work some more on programming and that type of thing. Planning and building, the capital projects include the official plan, the land banking development plan and servicing design, and the land banking business and marketing plan. Building a new truck, the operating projects with building a full-time position shared between public works and planning, and then bylaw a new truck as well. And the big one, environmental services, our wastewater treatment plant, of course, the distribution upgrades to Wallace and Harbor Streets, wastewater upgrades to Prince Edward Street in collaboration with Northumberland County. And the capital projects on the water side, the booster pumping station, the construction of the new garage, the water distribution upgrades to Wallace and Harbor, and water upgrades to Prince Edward Street, again in collaboration with the county. And there are our logos for our partnering agencies and boards. And some of our grant and aid recipients. And that brings us to a conclusion. So I'm happy to try to answer any questions. The majority of staff is here to be able to answer questions specifically if I can.
So first, I will ask if there are persons present who have questions or comments regarding the proposed 2025 budget. Come on up. Just
Hi.
get you to state your name for the record, please.
Amy McQuaid. First off, I wanted to thank everyone for their supporting of the Rainbow Youth Center. Your backing shows Brighton's commitment to a safer, more inclusive community. Supporting the Rainbow Youth Center doesn't ignore other groups. It reflects the Brighton's commitments to enhancing visibility and the 2S LGBTQ+ community. I wanted to highlight about 10.5% of youth age 15 to 24 in Canada identify as 2S LGBTQ+, facing significant challenges like higher rates of mental health issues, suicide, substance abuse, and homelessness. And our community has suffered from the lack of safe spaces and the vandalism linked to our visibility. The Rainbow Youth Center is a safe haven for youth and their supporters, offering a sense of belonging. And we partner with Parn, Rotary, the United Church, the Brighton Public Library, and local businesses to create the space. Parn is a community-based AIDS service organization supporting rainbow programs across their service area, and they help youth by creating a safer space. Funding comes from United Way, Peterborough, and we rely on municipalities like Brighton to ensure that there are services here in Brighton. This year, we were the only group to request less funding than initially applied for last year. And we wanted to highlight that that's part of our responsibility to being financially responsible and our commitment to Brighton as well. We also wanted to highlight that Meg Fox at the Tin Roof graciously donates the space every year. So we don't incur rent and other costs. So the grant money goes directly to programming in the community this year. I wanted to say that we also are happy that council supported the flying of the flags and other things, because sending a powerful message of unity and the welcoming of the 2S LGBTQ+ community right now is very important. It's not just about supporting youth, it's about creating a safe environment for everyone who cares for them, reflecting our community's values and acceptance. And Mr. Mayor, I want to thank you for your support as well. We're excited that we're kicking off our third year of Pop-Up Pride this year in the downtown. And all of the revenue generated from that event will be going to the Rainbow Youth Center. And we have 2 weeks of Pride planned this year. So we have a newly established Pride Committee that's been set up, and we are planning to have events all throughout that first 2 weeks. And we'll be working with ECDEV and others to make that happen. And lastly, I just wanted to say that I hope that we'll continue to be supported next year. We will be coming back for funding within the lower grant amount. And we hope that we will continue to get the funding from council because we think it's extremely important, especially with recent activities that are happening around the world and to our neighbors in the US. It is a very dangerous time for the 2S LGBTQ plus community, and visibility matters more than ever. So that's just on that item. And then I just wanted to say I appreciate the work that you guys do for the budget, and hopefully you'll continue to support us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone else present who has a question or comment with regard to the 2025 budget? Anyone joining us on Zoom? Are there any questions or comments regarding the budget from members of council? Councillor Wheeldon.
As usual, just want to compliment our staff on doing a phenomenal job. This is one of our biggest tasks as a council, but I understand that it's a much bigger task for staff. So thank you for your work. I didn't think that we were going to get down as far as we did. And so that seems miraculous, and I appreciate it very much. I also wanted to note how beautiful the presentation was this year. It's very clear and engaging, and I've heard good feedback from members of the public as well saying, I really understood this document. This is a great presentation. So well done.
Thank you for that. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Mayor. My first question, based on the page of budget challenges and opportunities. This is for the CAO, I think. You spoke about decrease in bank rates being an opportunity. Does that mean at some point this year, staff would be considering more external borrowing?
CAO.
Through Mr. Mayor to Councillor Rowley, yes. So we'll take a look at how it's impacting our internal budgets, and then certainly look at some external budget funding. That is the intent as we go through the document, and everything that Director Whitfield had prepared in advance of this is that indication that as we watch those rates come down, it would be beneficial for us to look at some external funding.
Thank you.
Councillor Butwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To the CAO, there was one page in particular that I thought was really well presented. It talked about where do your taxes go? If there's one slide out of that entire presentation that I think would be useful for the public to see, it's that one slide. And so whether we include that one slide in a separate set of communications, that would be really beneficial. Because I think that once you see it, it makes much more sense, or you can understand that, you know, everyone doesn't just sit in this building and do nothing, right? There's a lot of other things that cost. That didn't come out right. Intent was everything there. So the one thing I wanted to say about the budget, and I know that we've discussed this through this process, we did last year as well, specifically with the grant and aid program, and we've had a few words about it as well, that what we have set up there doesn't seem to sometimes make sense. And it might be, I know what we've talked and the mayor has spoken about, well, we'll look at this for next year and maybe through our development of policies. I think that it seems like across the board, there is a desire from council to see this reevaluated. Hard times ahead, I'm sure, for many, but focusing very much on the nonprofit aspect of it. We as council have the burden, I guess, of raising all of this money, taking money out of people's pockets and investing it in the best way possible. And I'd like to see that within whatever policy staff comes up with to bring to us, that there can be a greater emphasis on the accountability of the money and how it's being spent, so that we can see that not only, or so that we can see that the money that has been provided for has been allocated within their budget or their documents properly. So it doesn't just get put out there and we never hear from it again. So if that could be just a point to take back when you're, yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Mayor. And I would just like to maybe ask Ms. McQuaid regarding the Rainbow Youth Center. And there's no timeline on this. I know when we spoke during budget that at some point your financials would be available. So like I said, regardless of what we do tonight with the budget, if that would still be possible at some point. I would also like to point out, Ms. McQuaid, that last year you also said that you would give a list of ongoing programs that were there, and I did not see that in your presentation earlier. So if that could be included in your report back to council.
Are you prepared to comment?
I'm prepared to comment.
Go ahead.
PARN is a registered non-for-profit that is audited every year. We made it very clear when we made our application that our audited statements would be available in March when they're done every year. Also, there is a bit of concern from the people that support PARN and support the Rainbow Youth Center that we seem to be the focus of questions when other organizations are not asked the same level of transparency and other things. I'm more than happy in March to come back once our audited statements are done, but that's not a requirement. And I didn't do the presentation last year. And it's currently not a requirement of your grant system and not required of anyone other than the 2S LGBTQ+ Youth Center, which I find to be a little bit concerning. So I appreciate everyone on this council floor that supported us, and I hope that you will continue to support us. We are an audited organization. We support programming in the community, and we have a bunch of new programs coming out. We will be partnering with the Brighton Library, and we partner with local businesses. You're more than welcome at any point to come to our organization to see what we do. In the first bit, we didn't get up and running until, when was that? April, May? Was it cold? Yeah, I can't even remember because we were delayed. And we're in our first year of operations this year. And I'm not sure what was included in your grant application, but we were very clear about where the money would be going. And our first year of startup funding, we were very clear that it was for the startup of the organization and working on getting it going. So what are you looking for exactly for us to come back? And will you be requiring that of the other organizations that are here?
I don't require that. I'm just saying based on the meeting from last year, which you directed me to listen to last year's
Which you
2024.
incorrectly got wrong.
Which I did. I re-listened to that. It was all fine. At the end of that presentation, you made a comment regarding the kind of programs that you would be having and that you would give a report back. So I'm just.
And PARN will be back in March.
That's fine. This was based on 24's budget, not 25. So, and as I said, based on some of the other applications that we have, I want to go back to the Beacon Youth Center. Theirs was quite a bit. They had quite a bit there. They have an audited statement there. They also have a monthly report of attendance. Yours was a bit short on that. And so those are just the questions that I'm asking. I'm not asking for it to make a difference at this stage, whether or not the funding that you require is approved. Just looking for that report. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we're been more than respectful and open about and transparent about our organization and what we do. Again, I would just say that Councillor Rowley might want to apologize for insinuating at the last meeting that we did not have a complete application, that we did not have audited statements. You know, you think you said here that you were wrong, that you went back and watched the meeting. We never once said that we were not going to come back for money. We said very clearly that we were asking for startup funding in the first year of $9,500. And we are the only organization to come back and ask for less money. And we have asked for $5,000 under the new guiding program of the smaller grant, which, by the way, does not require us to come back to council, if I'm not mistaken, under the current grant policy.
Well, that's correct.
So I'm not sure why I'm being required, or the organization that I'm here helping and support tonight is being required to do something that is not under your current policy.
I don't think you're being required to do anything. I think one member of council is making a request.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really appreciate that.
And Councillor Rowley, if you want to follow up offline with PARN, please feel free to do so. Yeah, thank you. Last chance for members of council. I would point out that for years, some of us perhaps grilled the other youth center for other reasons. I know that Councillor Butwell did, and I had in the past as well, for very similar concerns. You apologized this year for that, not because you had concerns, but because you recognize, as I do, I think that they do good work in the community, regardless of maybe some overarching policies of an organization. Those policies do not seem to be levied locally, and I think that's where my concern was. I think that's where your concern came from, not to put words in anybody's mouth, but so, perhaps growing pains, let's hope so, and we'll move forward from there. Any other questions or comments from members of council on the 2025 budget? Motion is moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Rowley that council receive the 2025 budget presentation and any comments submitted by members of the public. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson. The council approved the 2025 budget with a 7.61% tax increase, and further that council direct staff to bring a bylaw to approve the budget estimates at the March 3rd, 2025 meeting. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. That brings us to citizens' comment. Ms. McQuaid, you have offered 2 comments. I think you've made one already. And so you know the rules. You've got 2 minutes. Your comment is with regard to funding for education, the motion that's being brought by Councillors Rowley and Wheeldon. Ms. McQuaid,
Correct.
you have the floor.
Just a little bit of background. Was a former student leader in the only institution, Durham College UIT, and Trenton Oshawa back in the day in 2008 and 2009. I would just hope that council might consider removing some of the stuff related to the international students. Now, I don't think that anything was done out of malice or harm, but the provincial government has been chronically underfunding the institutions of education for years, decades. And because of that, some and then all of the college and universities started to look at international students as a way to generate revenue. And that in turn caused a lot of issues and a lot of vulnerability to those students. I think the intent of the motion in requiring and asking for more funding is great. I just think that we should place the blame and place the onus on the government and not focus so much on the international students who have also been victim to these same policies and have not caused some of the things that they're being accused of causing. So I just hope that council would consider that.
Thank you for that comment. We'll see how that moves rolling forward when we get to that portion of the agenda. I will note that the Deputy Mayor left the chamber at 9 p.m. and returned at 9:01 p.m. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council receive the citizens' comments submitted at the February 18th, 2025 council meeting. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. That brings us to staff reports. Our first report is with regard to grant opportunity for active transportation infrastructure specific to Harbor Street. Manager Gooding, we've read your report. Do you have anything to add or highlight?
Through the mayor, no, I do not.
Thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council endorse the application for the Government of Canada Active Transportation Fund grant to fund potentially 60 to 100% of the active transportation infrastructure costs of the Harbor Street reconstruction project. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Our Next report is with regard to changes to Citizen of the Year and Volunteer Appreciation Event. Ms. Birch, we've read your report. Do you have anything to add or highlight?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do not.
Thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that Council rename and restructure the Citizen of the Year Award to align with the addition of the Volunteer of the Year event and to direct staff to bring forward an updated terms of reference. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Brings us to a report with regard to the Homelessness Task Force Terms of Reference. Deputy Clerk, we've read your report. Do you have anything to add or highlight?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Not at this time.
Thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley and, pardon me, I have a motion moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Rowley. But before I read it, I will ask on number 3, there are 2 blanks. Later on in the meeting, we will see a report from me talking about filling some committees, and the suggestion in those two blanks are Councillors Wheeldon and McCausland. Are you okay with that, Councillor Wright, to fill that in? Councillor Rowley, you're okay with that? So again, it's moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that Council adopt the draft terms of reference for the Homelessness Task Force and that Council direct staff to proceed with contacting the applicable community groups and agencies to inquire about a representative from each being appointed to the task force, and that Council appoint Councillor Wheeldon and Councillor McCausland as the Council representatives of the task force, and that Council direct staff to proceed with filling 1 community member position on the task force in accordance with the Committees of Council Administration policy. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Next report is the CAO ongoing report on and capital projects update. CAO, we've read this report. Do you have anything to add or highlight?
3, Mr. Mayor, just as noted earlier, the Transportation Master Plan will be delayed until the first meeting in May.
Thank you for that. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that Council receive the CAO ongoing report and capital projects update as information. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. That brings us to notices of motion and motions. We passed a motion that this notice would be read as a motion. And so it reads as follows. It is moved by Councillor Wheeldon and seconded by Councillor Rowley. Just a lot of that. Whereas post-secondary education is critical for enhancing our quality of life, supporting innovation and the development of intellectual property, and preparing our youth for skilled labor, and in 2014 was estimated to add $55 to $75 billion to the economy, according to the Conference Board of Canada. And whereas education funding models in Ontario pay the lowest amount among the provinces and have required post-secondary institutions to look to other revenue streams in order to develop and grow, including relying on the higher tuition paid by international students. And whereas the high number of international students at post-secondary institutions has been correlated to housing shortages for Canadians in Ontario, prompting a federal cap on study permits. And whereas this cap on study permits has significant impacts on a revenue stream post-secondary institutions have come to rely on, prompting layoffs and programming cuts that translate to a significant loss in local GDP, donations, and educational opportunities in our community. Therefore, be it resolved that the municipality of Brighton call upon the province of Ontario and the government of Canada to allocate sufficient funding to higher education to allow post-secondary institutions to thrive, and in so doing to support local communities and economies without relying on international student tuition to make up their shortfall. And be it further resolved that this resolution be sent to Ontario officials, including the Honourable Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, the Honourable Nolan Quinn, Ontario Minister of Colleges and Universities, the Honorable Paul Calandra, Ontario Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Merritt Stiles, Leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party, Bonnie Crombie, Leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, and Mike Schreiner, Leader of the Green Party of Ontario. And be it resolved that this resolution be sent to Canadian officials, including the Honorable Justin Trudeau. It should be the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau. Prime Minister of Canada, the Honorable Francois Philippe Champagne. Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, the Honorable Nate Erskine Smith. Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, Pierre Poilievre, Leader of the Official Opposition, Yves-François Blanchet, Leader of the Bloc Québécois, Jagmeet Singh, Leader of the New Democratic Party, and Elizabeth May, and Jonathan Pedno, co-leaders of the Green Party of Canada. And be it further resolved that this resolution be circulated to all Ontario municipalities, the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, the Council of Ontario Universities, the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, the Confederation of Ontario University Staff Associations and Unions, the College Student Alliance, the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario, and the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. Is there any discussion? Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate you reading all of that. I do want to acknowledge and appreciate the comments by Ms. McQuaid. I think we're trying to say the same thing. Before I moved to Brighton, I was a university registrar at a little institution in Manitoba and watched the economics of being underfunded result in a blooming population of international students. And that was 12 years ago. It has continued. At that time, the institution I was looking at, where I was working, we were looking at 30% international students, and that was making up for budget shortfalls from lack of provincial funding there. My understanding is that Loyalist was looking at up to 70% international students. And so it just shows how much this has progressed over the past decade. The reports I found from the Conference Board of Canada were commenting specifically on this issue in their 2014 report. And obviously their report did not persuade provincial governments to increase funding for post-secondary institutions, in spite of the fact that every dollar invested in post-secondary brings back, I don't even remember the amount, but it's many times over what the investment is in terms of supporting local communities, supporting innovation, job creation, all of those things. And so my goal had been with this motion to acknowledge the situation and the argument for the steps that have been taken, but to really tie it all together with that second whereas statement, which talks about how the funding models that are inadequately funding have led to all of these things. It is absolutely not the fault of international students that they wanted to study in Canada. I mean, we're an incredible country, and we no doubt draw lots of people who want to study here, and that's not the fault of international students, nor is the lack of housing their fault. But all of this situation stems from chronic underfunding going back many decades, and any party who's ever held government can take some blame for this. I wanted to make sure that this was said in a way that, or in a timeline that allowed for it to be acknowledged during an election. We have 2 elections this year, and that's why I included all of the parties at both levels. Realistically, will it make a difference? I don't know. But if we are going to defer any discussion of this, then it's going to miss the end of the Ontario election. And so I'd prefer if we could pass something tonight, and then maybe next month we pass another one directing it to the new government specifically. But I do get the intent of wanting to remove a few or rewrite some of the paragraphs in this motion to take international students out of it entirely, because it's not their fault. Again, my intention and the way that I still read my motion as the mayor was reading through it, I think makes it clear that it's not their fault, but that this is all stems from underfunding. But I would like to make this statement any way council desires.
Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead, Councillor Bowell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and to my colleague, Councillor Wheeldon. Knowing you as I do, I know that you never wrote this motion to read a certain type of way, if we can put it that way. I will say that in this climate where there are people who are feeling emboldened to say divisive things, it could very easily be read that way. It is, that type of thing is pretty high on my radar, and I think that what you were saying and hoping to say is valuable. I just don't think that it conveys enough how this is not the fault of the students. Let's be quite frank, if we didn't have the number of international students that we do at Loyalist, we would not have a Loyalist.
Councillor Wheeldon.
If I may propose an addition to the third statement, it currently reads, and whereas the high number of international students at post-secondary institutions has been correlated to housing shortages for Canadians in Ontario, prompting a federal cap on study permits, what if we added a line to that indicating that this effectively scapegoats international students and is unjust? Would that satisfy that concern?
Again, I understand where you're coming from, but I think that making a qualifying statement like that it kind of comes after we've already allowed the thought to permeate in our minds that it's their fault. And especially talking about housing shortages at this time, when I already see the constant berating and hate that's being spewed, especially in the Queenie West area. This community is being blamed for everything, taking jobs, taking housing, and they are here because we opened the door. So I'm not comfortable at all. No,
Taking jobs that nobody wants. by
that
the way.
nobody wants.
What if it was that third line? Is it third? Yeah, that third whereas statement was has been inaccurately correlated.
I mean, there is no denying that this many people who are temporary residents require this many houses. I perhaps unfairly and inaccurately. And I understand not wanting to include in there the putting any, even mentioning any potential blame on international students, but I also want to be able to name what it is that I'm trying to oppose with this statement. I feel like to be able to call that out and say that's not right, that's an incorrect assumption based on what is actually a provincial government's fault for not funding these institutions in the first place.
Councillor Bowell.
Thank you. May I assert then perhaps the motion should have been written a little bit more forcefully about our successive provincial government's unwillingness to properly fund post-secondary education, have it focus on the core issue as opposed to frame it around international students. Because this is not just about international students, it's about successive provincial governments' failure to properly fund all of the things that we have sorely needed, education being one of them.
I'm happy to be more forceful. I mean, I did mention that in the clause before, the one where I mentioned international students. So I really thought that would sort of set the tone of this, that these institutions are incredibly valuable. They have not been funded adequately. And now that's being blamed on international students because schools had to pivot in their business models to adjust to inadequate funding. How might we make that more forceful?
Councillor Wright.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, how about, and whereas there has been a pre-existing and growing housing shortage that has negatively and greatly impacted all students, local and international, causing a federal cap on study permits.
Whatever we decide on, someone's going to have to hand me the wording because I don't have a motion that I can mark up. I'm reading, I've literally written C11.1 for the clerk. So we'll have
I'll
to
give it to you after.
figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah. It replaces the whereas the high numbers of international students. It says, and whereas there has been a pre-existing and growing housing shortage that has negatively and greatly impacted all students, local and international, and causing a federal cap on study permits.
Councillor Butwell.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm kind of hoping to, in the second whereas, put a period after the word grow in the third last line. Take out that reference there because it kind of drops it in its own whereas. And then we kind of cover it off. And if we take the amended one that Councillor Wright, it makes the international student no longer the subject. They're like a added. I know what you're trying to do. I am just, again, knowing you the way that I do, your motive in this is absolutely
It's all good.
clean. But if we're going to circulate this to everybody around the province, I think we better be very careful.
At the end of the day, in the Quinte region, including Brighton, the losses out of Loyalist College amount to about 1% of GDP for us. So this is a huge plant closure, and like a huge plant closure. So whatever we say to help affect change at the provincial level for more consistent funding to the post-secondary level is good, and I agree with all of the discussion. Let's not even, and I know this is not your intent, but let's not even have an opportunity where someone can point a finger at the international community or international students. Go ahead, Councillor Wheeldon.
100% agree. I'm glad we're able to workshop this a little bit because what I most want is for that intent to come across. And so if it didn't come across the way I worded it, happy to adjust any way we can. So agree with that period at the end of that sentence, grow.
Okay.
And then agree with Councillor Wright's rewriting of the third clause. Ultimately, this needs to say that this is not the fault of international students and this is not the fault of post-secondary institutions, both of which we're just adopting to the conditions that the province set.
Okay, so whereas clause 1, good as is.
Yep.
Whereas clause 2,
Period at grow.
ends at grow.
Yep.
Removing, including, relying, etc. Whereas clause 3,
That's
the one that I've got.
that's yours? No, whereas clause 4 is yours, isn't it?
no.
No, okay, yep, okay. So whereas clause 3 reads, go ahead.
And whereas a pre-existing and growing housing shortage has negatively and greatly impacted all students.
Hang on. I'm at shortage.
Yep, has negatively
Yeah.
and greatly impacted all students, local
Hang on. Yeah.
and local and international.
Yeah.
And causing a federal cap on study permits.
Caused.
And having caused, yeah, and having caused.
Did you forward that to the clerk?
I can.
You have not?
I have not.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So clause 4. Good as is,
I think so.
and the rest is okay, correct?
Yes, you don't need to reread the litany of names.
And so then it goes, and therefore be it resolved that we ask for, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I've already read it. It's in front of you. And we send it to all the provincial people and all the federal people and all the institutional people. Councillor Butwell.
I just want to quickly reread the first therefore, because the last portion of the sentence says without relying on international student tuition. Again, it kind of throws it right at the,
That was the premise that
I know,
of the changes.
I understand. So I just want to digest that for a moment.
Which one were you talking about?
Sorry, which?
I don't think leaving that in puts a focus on anybody. I think what it does is puts a focus on the concern,
Mhm.
which is that frankly, international students were being relied on to fund university and college programming.
And to fund it for domestic students.
Yeah, so that we can continue to underfund provincial funding at the post-secondary level.
I can't speak for all institutions, but what I've noticed when I've looked around is that often international students, while providing what has become a core funding model, still often get less out of their educational experience than domestic students do. They are there as a funding model primarily, and schools do their best to incorporate them. But ultimately, it's a significant challenge for an institution to pivot toward an international audience. And they're primarily designed to support local students. And so this entire model has been out of whack. And if we had been adequately supporting it from the beginning, it would result in better programs for local and international students.
Councillor Rowley.
Thank you. So the concern that we've all had here around the table is that the focus is on international students. Should we be focusing on the lack of support from the government initially in the first place? And I'm wondering that in the second whereas, and whereas education funding models in Ontario, should we be putting the blame to the government there? Instead of like adding a bit of wording there. I don't know exactly what that would be, but it would take away, as I say, the focus of the international students kind of subsidizing what we're doing here, where it's the government that's lacking in funding. Is there a way to move that around a little bit?
As I read the second, it already does that.
I don't think it does it strong enough. Maybe.
Well,
If we're looking for.
you have to be careful with whereas statements. You don't want to be making your argument in whereas statements. You want to be presenting a fact in a whereas statement and then making your argument in the be it resolved portion.
That was, I guess, my question earlier about how might we make that stronger. I feel like I don't want to, what's the word? I don't know, put them on blast just in that statement. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that the funding model that they use, could we say provincial education funding models in Ontario? Just to be very specific about which government it is.
I'll add that if you'd like.
Whereas the Ontario government pays the lowest amount among the provinces for higher education. And that takes it into more active language.
Does that work?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. I guess that's just what I was trying to like, kind of thinking it over and over and over, that we don't want to focus on the international issue, but maybe we aren't focused enough on the province. So if it's one or two words that can fix that, that's fine by me.
So I'm gonna point out the changes. If you really want me to read it again, I will. And I'm assuming that councillors Wheeldon and Rowley are okay with these changes. So whereas statement 1 remains the same, whereas statement 2 changes to, and whereas the Ontario government pays the lowest amount among the provinces and have required post-secondary institutions to look to other revenue streams in order to develop and grow. Whereas statement number 3 reads, and whereas a pre-existing and growing housing shortage has negated and greatly impacted all students, local and international, causing a federal cap on study permits. Whereas statement number 4 remains the same, and all of the therefore statements remain the same. Councillor Wheeldon.
In the whereas number 2, whereas the Ontario government pays the lowest amount among the provinces for higher education. But otherwise, yes, to all of that.
So whereas 2 now reads, and whereas the Ontario government pays the lowest amount among the provinces for higher education. And have required post-secondary institutions to look to other revenue streams in order to develop and grow. Anything else? Any further discussion?
Just to say thank you. Appreciate you all contributing to this and making it stronger.
Councillor Butwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Perhaps we can preemptively add in a bunch of blank names, but who might be coming next and send it out automatically?
I would suggest that post-election, what we should do is probably have a conversation with our friends at Loyalist and see what they would like us to do in terms of advocacy.
We really don't see them come to this chamber, do we?
Not very often. The president of Loyalist College called me on the day that all of the layoffs were going to happen to let me know. But that's all.
That's it.
And they do have a representative that sits at the Quinte Economic Development Commission because of the involvement there with planning, but that was one of the people laid off. So we'll see who they send next. I don't know.
Mayor,
Yeah.
should we extend an invitation to someone from Loyalist to come here?
We can certainly do that.
It's,
As
long as that person isn't laid off.
I'm sure President Kirkpatrick would be more than willing to come and attend and talk to us about the issues. So I can certainly have that conversation with Mark. Yeah. Anything further on the motion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. That brings us to unfinished business. There's nothing listed under unfinished business. And then we come to bylaws. The first is a bylaw to stop up and close and sell Peter, John, and Donna Lorraine Archer. The motion is moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council gives a bylaw. It's for second and third reading and finally passes on this date. Being a bylaw to stop up, close, and sell a portion of an unopened road allowance comprising a portion of original road allowance described as Part 2 on, I should say lot, right? Lot 39R. Lot 39R 14657 being the southerly portion of road allowance lying west of County Road 30 and between Concession 1, Concession Gore in the former township of Seymour and part of Lot 37, Concession 10 of the former township of Brighton. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion is carried. The next is a bylaw with regard to development charges. It's moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council gives a bylaw. It's first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date. Being a bylaw for the imposition of development charges. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Brings us to reports and minutes of advisory committees of council, mayor reports and review teams. I think the only one is mine here with regard to committees, et cetera, et cetera. We've all had individual conversations about this in order to help place people in their way. By way of accountability, we're bringing forward this list for consideration this evening. This is entirely Hannah's fault. No. This is entirely because, of course, we have a new member of council who may have different interests, et cetera, than the former members. So we are trying to figure out the best places for people and so on and so forth as we continue our governance for the next couple of years. It's moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council receives this report from Mayor Ostrander, and further that council appoints members of council to committees, boards, and external agencies as noted in the report, and further that council directs staff to make the necessary arrangements for council appointments. Is there any discussion? Councillor Botwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So don't have any challenge to any of these appointments. Something did occur to me a couple of weeks ago, and I'm just going to take this opportunity to say it because I see it in the report here. So with respect to the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee that both Councillors Wheeldon and I sit on, we've often in good spiritedness referred to it as the Jedi Committee. I understand why we do. It's kind of fun. I think that we should consider using the actual words from this point on, reducing it to an acronym, kind of waters down its importance. And I would love to see us use the actual words justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'd love to see it, somebody try to say that those words aren't important in everything we do on that committee. So if we could consider not reducing it to an acronym, as fun as it is. Thank you.
I think due consideration to that can be given. Thank you for that. Anything further from members of council? Those in favor? Any opposed? The motion is carried. Brings us to reports and minutes of statutory committees, boards, and external agencies. The only one before us this evening is the library board minutes. It's moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council received the Brighton Public Library Board meeting minutes of November 27th, 2024 as presented. Councillors Rowley and Wright, do you have anything to add or highlight on these? Thank you. Any discussion from members of council? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. We have, oh, yes, we do. Correspondence item, which was the one added. The motion is moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council designate Councillor Hannah McCausland to attend the Northumberland County International Women's Day Professional Development Event on March 26, 2025. Councillor McCausland, are you willing to attend? Okay. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. FYI correspondence. The first is Think Tiny Homes Northumberland. It's moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wright. The council received the Think Tiny Homes Northumberland newsletter, January 2025, as information. Is there any discussion? Councillor Wheeldon.
I should declare a non-disqualifying interest because I'm on the board of Think Tiny Homes Northumberland, and this FYI correspondence is about a website that I made and was paid for through a grant from Community Power Northumberland. This is about planning considerations for tiny homes and all ADUs. And so through this project, I was looking at all of the planning documents for every municipality in Northumberland. My head still isn't screwed on right after that. But I will say that when it came time to try to summarize the ADU or additional dwelling unit planning considerations for the municipality of Brighton, I discovered that we already have it in a single PDF, and I just had to link to it. It was the easiest page in the whole part of the website. So appreciate our planning staff and their foresight in that regard. The goal of this website is to make it easier for people to understand planneries as they look to get an additional dwelling unit in their home or in their driveway or backyard if it's a tiny home, so that we can get more housing.
Thank you for that, Councillor Wright.
Could we then have that link added to our newsletter from the municipality to the residents so that they have clear access to it?
It's entirely up to, I guess, economic development staff. I would look to the only representative in the room who's nodding her head yes and making a note in her journal.
Thanks, Caroline.
Anything further from members of council? All those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. Next item is an update from Northumberland County. It's moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley. The council received the updates from Northumberland County, February 3 to 14, 2025 as information. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? Any opposed? That motion's carried. And from the Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus, it's moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley. The council received the correspondence from the Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus resolution of support of the Canadian and Ontario government's negotiations with the United States government on trade tariffs. Is there any discussion? Could we support the correspondence? Is that okay? I know it's supporting a correspondence of support, but there it is. So I've changed received to support. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Brings us to question period. Are there any questions from the person in the gallery? That brings us to our closed session. Do we want to break? So it is 9:39 p.m. We will take a 5-minute recess and reconvene at 9:44. is 9:45. I'll call this meeting back to order and proceed with the motion to proceed into closed session is moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson. The council resolve itself into closed session February 18th, 2025 at 9:45 p.m. pursuant to the Ontario Municipal Act RSO 2001 as amended subsection 239(2)B. Personal matters about an identifiable individual, including municipal or local board employees. Review of committee and board applications. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. We'll give staff a moment session. Thank you, everyone. I have a motion moved by Council Rowley, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that Council rise and report from closed session February 18th, 2025 at 10:15 p.m. Is there any discussion? All in favor? Motion's carried. Council met in closed session to consider matters it is permitted to do so under the Municipal Act and as listed on today's council agenda and the closed session resolution. The following items were considered during the closed session and may require motions as necessary. The first was the approval of the closed session meeting minutes of February 10th. A procedural motion to adopt the minutes was voted on in closed session. Therefore, there remains nothing to be done in the public open session. Item 2 was a personal matter about an identifiable individuals, including municipal local board employees. We reviewed committee appointments, and I have a motion to provide direction to staff. It's moved by Council Rowley, seconded by Council Wright. The council received the confidential boards and committees applications for appointments in closed session February 18th, 2025. And further, that council appoint A. Vowles and S. Laux to the Brighton Public Library Board for the remainder of the 2022 to 2026 term, and that council appoint D. Bennett to the Applefest Steering Committee for the remainder of the 2022 to 2026 term. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. And I have a motion moved by Councilor Wright, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the Corporation of the Municipality of Brighton Council meeting held on February 18th, 2025. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. And a motion moved by Councilor Wright, seconded by Councilor Rowley, that February 15th council meeting adjourn at 10:16 p.m. Is there any discussion? All in favor? That motion's carried. May we continue to have enduring peace and prosperity in Brighton and across Canada, and may God save the King.